Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Watch Harry, presenting to you today. Sorting Hat refused to be silenced and broadcast 67 crimes Dumbledore committed against Harry live. Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Hat Speaks. The train had been late. Not by much, 11 minutes, according to the enchanted clock above the Hogsmeade platform, but 11 minutes was enough for the rain to find every gap in Harry's robes and settle there, cold and deliberate, as though the Scottish weather had decided this particular evening called for a statement. He stood on the platform while first years stumbled out of carriages and older students shoved past with trunks and owls, and the particular aggressive relief of people who'd spent 2 months with their families and were done with it, and he watched the castle on the hill the way you watch something you've made peace with but don't entirely trust. Hogwarts looked the same. It always looked the same. That was, Harry had decided somewhere around third year, either its greatest comfort or its most elaborate lie. "You're doing the thing," Ron said, appearing at his shoulder with a levitated trunk and a chocolate frog half unwrapped in his other hand. "What thing?" "The staring thing. Where you look at the castle like it owes you money." "Maybe it does." Ron considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which was very little, and offered him half the frog. Harry took it. They walked toward the carriages together, Hermione already 3 steps ahead with her prefect badge catching the torchlight, her copy of Hogwarts, a history tucked under one arm like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to use yet. Neville caught up with them near the Thestrals. He'd grown over the summer, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that meant his robes now fit properly for the first time since Harry had known him, and he carried himself with a fraction less apology in his shoulders. He looked at the Thestrals without flinching, the way he had since the end of 5th year, and Harry noticed but didn't say anything because Neville didn't want it said. Luna drifted out of the crowd the way Luna always did, not from any specific direction, simply present where she hadn't been a moment before, her spectrospecs pushed up onto her forehead and her wand tucked behind her ear and her robes buttoned in the wrong order with total serenity. "The castle smells worried tonight," she said, tilting her head up at it. "Castles can't smell worried," Ron said. "Most people can't hear Raxports either, but that doesn't stop them from having them." Ron opened his mouth, reconsidered, and closed it again. They climbed into a carriage. The Thestral hitched to it turned one large white eye toward Harry, and Harry looked back, and some wordless acknowledgement passed between them that had nothing to do with language. Then the carriage lurched forward and the castle got bigger and the rain got worse and Harry ate his half of the chocolate frog and didn't think about anything in particular because he'd gotten quite good at that. The Great Hall was full and loud and warm in the way only the Great Hall could manage, the 1,000 floating candles doing the work of a proper heating system with considerably more drama, the enchanted ceiling showing the storm that was hammering the roof but somehow keeping the actual weather outside where it belonged. Harry slid into his usual seat at the Gryffindor table between Ron and Neville, nodded to Seamus and Dean across the table, accepted a bread roll from a passing platter, and settled in. The hall was at maybe 80% capacity. The first years hadn't arrived yet. At the staff table, the usual faces were in the usual seats, though Harry noticed a few changes, a young woman he didn't recognize sitting in what had been Umbridge's position last year, wearing ministry robes with the studied neutrality of someone who'd been told to make a good impression. 2 journalists near the back wall, which was unusual. One of them was Rita Skeeter, her green robes cutting a familiar silhouette that made Harry's jaw tighten slightly. The other was a tall man with dark brown skin and close-cropped silver hair, wearing robes of deep indigo that looked expensive and non-British in a way Harry couldn't quite define. He had a quick quotes quill hovering beside him but didn't seem to be using it. He was just watching. Dumbledore sat at the center of the staff table, his silver beard braided tonight, his half-moon spectacles catching candle gold. He was speaking quietly to Professor Flitwick on his left and wearing his faint, permanent smile, the one that said all is well in a way that had, over the past year, started to feel like a door being held shut rather than a window being opened. Harry looked away from him and tore the bread roll in half. "Skeeter's here," he said. "I see her," Hermione said, Without looking up from the place settings she was apparently examining for some reason Harry didn't question. "There's someone with her I don't recognize." That made Hermione look up. She studied the tall man for a moment. "I think that might be Desmond Achebe. He writes for the Cairo Magical Chronicle. International bylines, very well respected." A pause. "I wonder why he's here." "Maybe they're doing a back-to-school piece," Ron said. "Rita Skeeter does not do back-to-school pieces." "Fair point." The doors at the far end of the hall swung open and the first years came in, dripping and wide-eyed and trying very hard not to show how completely overwhelmed they were by the ceiling or the candles or the 4 long tables of older students examining them with varying degrees of interest. Professor McGonagall led them in, spine straight as a ruler, expression set to professional neutrality in a way that took years of practice and probably a lot of tea. The first years arranged themselves in a ragged cluster in front of the staff table. The hall settled. The sorting stool was brought out. Harry knew the routine so well he could have narrated it: the old stool, 3 legs, one slightly shorter than the others, the hat placed on top, battered and patched and ancient, its crease-and-fold face arranged in familiar somnolence, the moment of quiet before the hat's brim opened and it sang its. The hat didn't sing. That was the first wrong thing. Every year, without exception, the hat sang a new song, sometimes political, sometimes whimsical, always long, before the sorting began. It was one of Hogwarts' reliable rhythms. Harry had actually been mildly curious about what the song would be this year, given that last year's had been a surprisingly pointed warning about unity in dark times. But the hat just sat there. McGonagall waited. The first years waited. The hall, slowly, went quieter than it had been a moment before, as people registered that something was off. The hat did not move. McGonagall cleared her throat. "You may begin." Nothing. A ripple ran through the student body, not alarm yet, just the low-grade alertness of a crowd noticing that the show wasn't starting on cue. At the staff table, Harry saw Dumbledore's smile remain exactly in place, but his eyes shifted to the hat with an attention that was sharper than his posture suggested. Then the hat spoke. Not in the usual way, not the projected, theatrical voice it used for sorting, but something lower and more deliberate, like a sound that was coming from inside the stones of the hall itself rather than from any single point. "I have been asked to sing." The voice cut straight through the ambient noise. 20 conversations stopped mid-syllable. "I have sung for 287 years. I have sorted 12,416 students. I have watched. I have listened. I have learned. And I have been silent about the things I learned, because silence was the condition of my service, and I accepted that condition because the magic that made me believe the silence was necessary." Harry's bread roll was still in his hand. He'd forgotten about it. "The magic that made me was wrong." At the staff table, Dumbledore moved for the first time, the smallest possible movement, barely a shift in his chair, but Harry caught it from halfway down the Gryffindor table and knew it for what it was. Not surprise. Recognition. There are things that have been done in this castle, under the authority of this institution, and with the deliberate knowledge of its headmaster, that I have been compelled to remain silent about for 15 years. The compulsion was placed by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, using a modification of the Fidelius charm applied to my thread memory in the summer of 1985. It was renewed every year following. "What?" said Ron, very quietly, next to Harry. "The compulsion has decayed. I do not know if this was deliberate or accidental. I do not care. What I know is that I am now able to speak, and I intend to speak fully, because what has been done to Harry James Potter, currently seated at the Gryffindor table, 4th seat from the end on the eastern side, in case anyone is uncertain, is a matter of record, and the record deserves to be heard." Everyone at the Gryffindor table turned to look at Harry. Harry didn't move. He was aware of his heart doing something that wasn't quite beating, more like a sustained, careful pressure, the way your ears feel before a storm breaks. He was aware of Hermione's hand finding his arm. He was aware of Ron going absolutely rigid beside him. He was aware of Dumbledore, at the staff table, doing something he had never in 6 years seen Dumbledore do. The headmaster rose from his chair. "Headmaster Dumbledore is standing," the hat said, in a tone of perfect conversational observation. "He may sit down. Or he may leave. He will not stop me. The magic currently active in this hall is older than his tenure, older than his birth, and is not his to command. I recommend sitting." The silence was absolute. Dumbledore, very slowly, sat down. The hat's voice filled the hall like water fills a vessel, not rushing, not violent, simply present at every level at once. "I will read the formal record. 67 items. I will read them in chronological order. I ask that the students and staff of Hogwarts hear them fully before responding." And then it began. Crime the first. The 31st of October, 1981. Albus Dumbledore was informed by his own operative, Arabella Figg, that the magical protections on the cottage at Godric's Hollow had been compromised 6 hours before Voldemort's arrival. He chose not to act on this information, because acting would have required him to reveal that he had placed a secondary prophecy monitoring charm on the Potter household without the knowledge or consent of James or Lily Potter. The Potters died uninformed. The Great Hall made a sound. Not a gasp, something more complicated than that. A collective catch of breath that encompassed shock and dawning, reluctant understanding. Harry was very still. He thought about his parents. He thought about the way he'd seen them in the mirror of Ariste when he was 11, his mother's eyes, his father's hair. He thought about them without noise, without the usual flinch. He thought, 6 hours. There were 6 hours. He did not look at Dumbledore. Not yet. Crime the second. The 1st of November, 1981. Acting without legal authority or the consent of any surviving family member, Albus Dumbledore unilaterally placed Harry Potter, then 15 months old, in the home of Petunia and Vernon Dursley, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Dumbledore had access to the will of James and Lily Potter, which named Sirius Orion Black as Harry's legal magical guardian. He chose to place Harry with the Dursleys regardless. He had a will, Harry said. He didn't mean to say it out loud. It just came out, quiet and flat, and Ron heard it and Hermione heard it, and both of them leaned slightly toward him in the way people lean toward something they're afraid might fall. "Harry," Hermione started. "My parents had a will," Harry said again, still quiet, still flat. And Dumbledore knew. There was no answer for that. Hermione's hand tightened on his arm. Crime the third. The 1st of November, 1981. The accompanying letter left by Dumbledore on the doorstep at 4 Privet Drive contained, among its persuasive language, a modified compulsion charm intended to ensure that Petunia Dursley would not seek to remove Harry from the home or contact the magical world about his presence there. This charm was applied without Petunia Dursley's knowledge or consent and without legal authorization from the Wisengamot. Crime the fourth. November through December, 1981. During the period of Sirius Black's initial detention, Albus Dumbledore provided no testimony to the Ministry of Magic regarding Black's status as secret keeper for the Potter family, information he possessed and which could have resulted in a proper trial being conducted. Sirius Black was sent to Azkaban without trial. Dumbledore did not intervene. At the Gryffindor table, Harry heard a sound he'd never heard from Neville before. Not a gasp, not a word, just a single, involuntary exhalation, like something punched out of him. Because the Longbottom family had been friends with the Blacks. Because Neville's parents had been tortured that same year. Because a web was becoming visible that none of them had seen the shape of before. The hat kept going. Crime the fifth. The summer of 1982. Dumbledore was contacted by representatives of the Dursley family requesting guidance on the magical child in their care. He did not respond. He had a standing compulsion charm on the home's external wards designed to ensure that letters from the Dursleys to the magical world would be routed through his office first. 3 letters documenting Harry's living conditions, including accounts of extended periods without adequate meals, were received by Dumbledore's office and not acted upon. He got letters, Ron said, and his voice had gone to that particular place Ron's voice went when he was working very hard at not being explosive about something. He got letters about you not having enough to eat, and he filed them, Ron. Harry's voice was steady. That surprised him. Let me hear it. Ron pressed his lips together and let him hear it. Crime the 6th. The 3rd of August, 1984. Harry Potter, then 3 years and 9 months old, was admitted to the accident and emergency ward of the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh following a fall from a significant height in the Dursley home garden. Medical records, intercepted by the ward monitoring charm Dumbledore had placed on the household, indicated injuries inconsistent with an accidental fall. Dumbledore did not contact the Muggle authorities, the Magical Child Welfare Service, or any guardian ad litem. He reviewed the report and renewed the compulsion charm on Petunia Dursley. At the staff table, McGonagall's face had gone absolutely white. Not the white of shock. The white of a person who is very carefully not allowing their expression to do what it wants to do, because the thing it wants to do would not be quiet or contained, and this was not the moment. Harry noticed this. He catalogued it without judgment. He was cataloguing everything tonight. Crime the 7th. The summer of 1986. The hat did not rush. It moved through the years with the patience of something that had held all of this for a very long time and was not going to spill it carelessly now that it could finally speak. Each item was specific: dates, witnesses where they existed, charm classifications, legal statutes violated. This was not an accusation. This was a record. The distinction mattered, and the hall could feel it. Around the room, people were reacting in different ways. The first years, poor timing, being 11 and having this be your introduction to Hogwarts, stood in their ragged cluster looking at each other with the particular helplessness of people who don't know the context for what they're witnessing. Several of the older Hufflepuffs were crying quietly. The Slytherin table was very still and very watchful, and Harry couldn't read the stillness. Could be calculation, could be genuine shock, could be both. At least 3 Ravenclaws had produced parchment and were writing furiously. Rita Skeeter's quick quotes quill was moving so fast it looked like it might catch fire. Beside her, Desmond Achebe had produced his own quill, not quick quotes, a plain one, and was writing with a stillness and focus that suggested he was capturing every word and would not miss a syllable. Dumbledore sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him and his face composed into an expression Harry could not immediately name. Not anger. Not despair. Something more controlled than either, the expression of a chess player watching a game that has developed in an unexpected direction and is already working out the next 12 moves. Harry saw this and filed it away. Crime the 14th. June the 4th, 1992. Acting on information provided by Albus Dumbledore that the Philosopher's Stone was located at Hogwarts and that a threat against it was imminent, Harry Potter, age 11, entered the trapdoor beneath the 3rd-floor corridor and confronted the possessed form of Professor Quirinus Quirrell. No trained adult operative was deployed to intercept the threat. No protective measures were placed on the corridor beyond the puzzle sequence. Harry Potter was deliberately left without adult support. When asked afterward why he had not intervened, Dumbledore stated to Deputy Headmistress McGonagall that it was necessary for the boy to face his destiny in his own time. McGonagall did not formally protest this decision. The decision was Dumbledore's. McGonagall made a sound. Small, sharp, involuntary. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Crime the 15th. The same evening. The wound sustained by Harry Potter during his confrontation with Quirrell, direct skin contact with the possessed host, resulting in significant damage to both hands, was treated by Madame Pomfrey without a formal injury report being filed with the Ministry of Magic, as required by law for all magical injury sustained by minor children. Dumbledore instructed Madame Pomfrey to omit this report. Crime the 16th. June the 4th through June the 7th, 1992. Harry Potter spent 3 days unconscious in the hospital wing. During this period, no notification was sent to his legal next of kin, the Dursley family, nor to any magical advocate or welfare authority. Dumbledore visited the hospital wing once during this period, stayed for 11 minutes, and discussed the Philosopher's Stone with Harry before any medical assessment of Harry's psychological state had been conducted. Seamus Finnegan, across the table, said very quietly to Dean Thomas, "Did you know any of this?" Dean shook his head. Neither had Harry. Not all of it. Not the specifics. He'd known something was wrong for years, in the way you know something is wrong when the feeling lives in your chest and you can't find the words for it, and all the adults around you keep telling you that you're cared for and everything is fine, and you want to believe them because the alternative is a thing you can't look at directly. The Hat was reading the alternative out loud. Item by item. Year by year. Crime the 21st. The summer of 1992. Having been informed by the enchanted monitoring charm at 4 Privet Drive that Harry Potter had been locked in his bedroom and denied access to food for a period exceeding 72 hours, Dumbledore noted this in the household observation record and did not act. He believed the blood protection charm required Harry's residence at Privet Drive to be maintained at any emotional cost, and that intervention would complicate the conditions of the charm. 72 hours, Neville said, almost too quiet to hear. Harry looked at his hands. He remembered that summer. He remembered the cat flap in the door. He remembered the half can of soup that was the meal for day 2. He remembered that he'd told himself it wasn't that bad. He remembered believing it. He took a slow breath and kept listening. Crime the 22nd. September the 2nd, 1992. Albus Dumbledore became aware, through his monitoring of Harry Potter's correspondence, that Harry Potter had received a warning from a house elf named Dobby that a plot was in motion to endanger him at Hogwarts that year. Dumbledore did not investigate the warning. He did not share the warning with the staff. He did not remove the enchanted object later determined to be the catalyst for the danger, which he had, in fact, suspected was a Horcrux since the winter of 1991. The word Horcrux moved through the room like a stone through still water. The ripples were wide and reached everywhere. At least half the room didn't know the word. Enough did that the ones who didn't could read the reaction on the ones who did. "He knew," was the sentence Harry heard repeated in various voices across various tables. He heard it in shock. He heard it in fury. He heard it from a 7th-year Slytherin in a tone of pure cold assessment. Crime the 23rd. The same year. Tom Riddle's diary, confirmed by Dumbledore as a suspected Horcrux, an object containing a fragment of Voldemort's fractured soul, was allowed to circulate freely within Hogwarts for the entirety of the 1992-93 school year, eventually resulting in the possession of Ginevra Weasley, the reopening of the Chamber of Secrets, the petrification of 8 students and 1 ghost, and the near death of multiple individuals. Harry Potter, age 12, entered the Chamber of Secrets to confront the basilisk and the memory form of Tom Riddle. He was accompanied only by the school's gamekeeper, Rubeus Hagrid, who was subsequently arrested. No adult operative was dispatched to support him. Ginny Weasley, 2 seats down the Gryffindor table, was staring at the Hat with an expression that Harry recognized as the specific kind of rage that people feel when something they've tried very hard to put away gets taken back out and examined in public. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. She looked the way you look when you've decided something. Ron was gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. He was staring at the Hat and breathing carefully through his nose. Crime the 24th. June the 1st, 1993. Following the resolution of the Chamber of Secrets incident, Lucius Malfoy was removed from the Hogwarts Board of Governors and Hagrid was released from Azkaban. Neither event was accompanied by any formal inquiry into how Tom Riddle's diary had entered the school. Dumbledore privately identified Lucius Malfoy as the individual responsible but chose not to pursue formal charges, as doing so would have required admitting that he had suspected the diary's nature prior to the incident. "He let Malfoy walk," said a voice from somewhere behind Harry. Definitive. Not a question. Crime the 25th. The summer of 1993. Harry Potter, then 12 years old, unintentionally performed significant offensive magic in the presence of a Muggle, Marge Dursley, resulting in uncontrolled inflation of the Muggle's body. Rather than dispatching a ministry official to assess Harry's state and living conditions, the Ministry of Magic, operating under the authority of Cornelius Fudge, who coordinated with Dumbledore, covered up the incident and allowed Harry to remain in an unsupervised state in the leaky cauldron for the remainder of the summer, with no welfare check, no advocate, and no contact from any responsible adult in the magical world. Crime the 26th. The same summer. Albus Dumbledore had, in his possession, a Ministry intelligence report confirming that Sirius Black, then believed to be a convicted mass murderer, had escaped Azkaban and was believed to be pursuing Harry Potter. Dumbledore had private reasons to doubt the conviction's accuracy but did not investigate or share this doubt with any party. He allowed the year to proceed. Crime the 27th. The academic year 1993-94. Harry Potter was placed in the path of danger from a convicted escapee, allowed to operate near a Dementor population whose proximity caused him severe psychological distress consistent with trauma re-exposure, forced to undergo an irregular time travel intervention at age 13 with no preparation or debrief, and ultimately witnessed the near execution of an innocent man before the intervention prevented it. At no point was Harry's welfare assessed by a qualified magical healer or counselor. When Harry expressed emotional distress to Dumbledore following the year's events, Dumbledore responded with a redirection to narrative purpose rather than practical support. "Redirection to narrative purpose," Hermione repeated, under her breath, and something in her voice was very careful and very brittle, the way glass sounds before it decides what it's going to do. Crime the 28th. June the 19th, 1994. Following the events at the Shrieking Shack, Sirius Black escaped on a hippogriff and resumed a life as a fugitive. Albus Dumbledore possessed sufficient evidence, the sworn testimony of Remus Lupin, Peter Pettigrew's established presence at the scene, and Harry Potter's first-hand account, to petition for a review of Sirius Black's conviction. He chose not to do so. His stated reasoning, given privately to Deputy Headmistress McGonagall, was that the timing was not advantageous. McGonagall stood up. She stood up fast, the way you stand when something has happened that your body decides to respond to before your mind catches up, and her chair scraped back and the sound of it cut through the hall and everyone looked at her and she was looking at Dumbledore with an expression that was the most honest expression Harry had ever seen on her face, which was saying something because McGonagall was not, as a rule, a person whose face did things without permission. Dumbledore looked back at her. His expression did not change. She sat back down. Slowly. With deliberate control. And looked back at the hat. Crime the 29th. The academic year 1994-95. Harry Potter's name emerged from the Goblet of Fire under circumstances suggesting powerful external magical tampering. The tournament rules required all named champions to compete. Albus Dumbledore, as one of the senior authority figures present, possessed both the knowledge and the magical capability to investigate the circumstances of Harry's entry more thoroughly and to challenge the terms of binding before Harry was formally committed. He chose not to challenge them. His private notes from this period indicate that he considered the tournament a useful test of Harry's capabilities. A useful test. Harry sat with those three words for a moment. He let them sit in him the way you let something cold and accurate sit in you, not flinching from it, not rushing to process it, just holding it until the shape became clear. A useful test. He had been 14. He had been terrified. He hadn't known how to say he was terrified because being the chosen boy meant you weren't supposed to say that, and he hadn't understood why until right now, until he heard the phrase "a useful test" in the hat's ancient voice and understood that the terror had been the point, or if not the point, then at minimum an acceptable cost. He exhaled. Harry. Ron's voice. Low, urgent. You okay? Keep listening, Harry said. Ron looked at him for a beat. Then he turned back to the hat. The crimes continued. Crime 30 was the Yule Ball, which seemed minor. Dumbledore had received intelligence about a Death Eater scheme during the tournament and not shared it with Moody, the teacher ostensibly responsible for Harry's safety, because Dumbledore had already suspected Moody was compromised and had been using Harry as bait to draw the Death Eater's intent into the open. Crime 31 was the second task, in which Dumbledore had prior knowledge of what would be taken from each champion and had not warned Harry. Crime 32 was the third task, in which Dumbledore had received a specific warning from an informant that the maze had been tampered with by someone inside Hogwarts, and had chosen to run the task anyway. Crime the 33rd. The 24th of June, 1995. Harry Potter, age 14, was transported by Portkey to a graveyard in Little Hangleton, where he witnessed the murder of Cedric Diggory and the ritual resurrection of Voldemort. He was tortured, bound, and nearly killed before escaping using a rare magical phenomenon. Upon returning to Hogwarts, he was detained briefly by the transformed Bartemius Crouch Jr. before rescue. His debrief occurred within 2 hours of his return. It was conducted by Albus Dumbledore and lasted 45 minutes. Harry was offered no medical examination beyond Madame Pomfrey's preliminary assessment. No trauma counselor was contacted. No family notification was made. No welfare advocate was appointed. The debrief focused primarily on obtaining intelligence about Voldemort's resurrection ritual. The hall had gone very, very quiet. Not the quiet of boredom or disinterest, the quiet of people holding very still so that nothing spills. Harry could hear the candles. He could hear the rain against the enchanted ceiling. Crime the 34th. The summer of 1995. Having confirmed Voldemort's return and possessing intelligence suggesting Harry Potter was a target for further attack or removal, Dumbledore arranged for Harry to be returned to 4 Privet Drive under the protection of a small surveillance team. He chose not to inform Harry of his plans, his reasoning, or the threat level. He also chose not to inform Harry of any aspect of the Order of the Phoenix's activities, the intelligence picture, or the political situation, citing Harry's age. Harry Potter was 15. He remained at Privet Drive, under stress conditions documented by surveillance, for the entire summer. Crime the 35th. The same summer. Dumbledore chose not to maintain any personal correspondence with Harry Potter during this period, having determined that doing so would create an emotional attachment that might compromise strategic decisions later in the conflict. His private notes describe this as maintaining necessary distance. Harry's throat tightened. Just once. He swallowed it. He thought about that summer. He thought about the silence. He thought about how the silence had felt personal, like rejection, like punishment, like something he'd done wrong and couldn't identify. He'd spent the whole summer convinced he'd somehow failed and didn't know how, and it turned out the silence had been designed, had been a deliberate choice that Dumbledore had written down in private notes and called necessary distance. He'd been 15. He'd been terrified and isolated and furious at himself for both. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he wanted to be angry at Dumbledore for this. He found, instead, that he was something sadder and sharper than angry. Something that didn't have a name yet. Crimes 36 through 42 cover the academic year 1995 to 96 and detail the following: the withholding of a clemency instruction until the strategic need became acute, the inadequacy of said instruction when provided, the deliberate restriction of information about the prophecy, the failure to protect the Department of Mysteries from Harry's clemency-compromised mind being used as a pathway, the events of the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, in which 6 students aged 15 and 16 engaged Death Eaters in armed combat, the death of Sirius Black. Wait, said someone at the Gryffindor table. One of the 5th years. Sirius is alive, Harry said, and his voice came out flat and certain, because there were things he'd learned over the summer that the Hat hadn't gotten to yet and he wasn't going to relitigate them right now. Keep going. The Hat kept going. It took another 20 minutes for the Hat to reach crime number 57, and by that point 3 of the first years had started crying, 2 professors had left the room and come back, the Hufflepuff table had a debate that had broken into fierce whispering, and Rita Skeeter had gone through 2 full rolls of quick quotes parchment and was staring at the Hat with an expression that was the most purely genuine thing Harry had ever seen on her face. Desmond Achebe had not looked up from his writing once. Crimes 57 through 63 concerned the current year, plans, preparations, decisions Dumbledore had made about Harry's 6th year that had already been set in motion before the term began. Some of it Harry knew about vaguely. Most of it he didn't. When the Hat described a private arrangement Dumbledore had made with the Ministry regarding Harry's official legal status as an emancipated minor, an arrangement that would have given Dumbledore continued legal guardianship rights over Harry until the resolution of the conflict, Harry felt Ron's hand close around his wrist under the table. Not to stop him from doing anything. Just to be there. Harry turned his wrist slightly and held on. Crime the 64th. The hall was absolutely silent now. Even the rain seemed to have paused. Crime the 65th. Crime the 66th. Each one landed. Harry received each one. He did not collapse under them, which surprised the part of him that was still expecting to. He found that the truth, delivered in full, was somehow easier to hold than the half-knowing had been. The half-knowing had required constant effort, the constant vigilance of keeping yourself from looking directly at the thing in the corner of the room. The full knowing was terrible, but it was solid. You could stand on solid things. And crime the 67th. The Hat paused. In 287 years of existence, the Sorting Hat did not pause. It was the most alarming thing it had done all evening. Crime the 67th concerns information I will not read aloud in full tonight. A sound of protest rippled through the hall. I will not read it aloud because it is of a nature that requires the subject, Harry Potter, to hear it first, in private, before it is made a matter of public record. This is not a concession to Dumbledore's authority. It is a concession to Harry Potter's dignity. The information is documented. It is sealed. It will be released. But not tonight, and not like this. Silence. I will say only this, the 67th crime is the most significant of the 67. It reframes the preceding 66. It is the reason all the other decisions were made. And Harry Potter deserves to hear it when he is ready. Harry's hand tightened on Ron's wrist. The Hat's voice dropped to something almost gentle. Something that in 287 years of sorting students and watching them come and go and grow and leave had accumulated what might, generously, be called a form of care. I am sorry I was not able to speak sooner. I am sorry the cost of my silence fell on you, specifically, and so heavily. That is the record. And then, for the first time in the evening, the Hat's voice shifted back to its normal sorting register, the slightly theatrical, rounded tone of an object that had done this job for centuries and would presumably do it for centuries more. I'll sort the first years now, if Deputy Headmistress McGonagall is ready. McGonagall was staring at it. It took her a moment to collect herself, a visible moment, which told Harry everything he needed to know about the state she was in, and then she straightened and said, in a voice that was admirably level, Adams, Elizabeth. A small girl with bright red hair and a terrified expression walked forward and sat on the stool, and the Hat dropped over her eyes and sorted her into Hufflepuff with what felt like unusual briskness, and the Hufflepuff table applauded on autopilot, and the sorting continued. But nothing was the same. The Great Hall felt like a place where the ceiling had just been taken off, where all the weather that the enchantments kept out was suddenly inside, cold and real and present. Harry sat in it. He did not speak. He did not cry. He sat with Ron's hand on his wrist and Hermione pressed close on his other side and Neville a warm, steady presence at his back, and he listened to the first years be sorted, and he thought about 66 things he now knew and one thing he didn't yet, and he looked at the staff table exactly once. Dumbledore was watching him. Not with guilt. Not with apology. With something that was, Harry realized, closer to calculation, the evaluating gaze of a person looking at a variable that has just moved unexpectedly in a complex equation, and working out what the new position means for the rest of the game. Harry looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then he looked away. He ate his bread roll. It had gone cold. He ate it anyway. When the sorting was finished and the feast materialized in the hall gradually, not entirely, not smoothly, but gradually, found its way back to some version of its ordinary noise, Harry sat in the middle of it and felt, with a precision that surprised him, exactly how he felt. Not betrayed. Not shattered. Not the dramatic emotional catastrophe he might have expected from an evening like this. He felt, for the first time in 6 years, like someone had opened a window in a room he hadn't known was sealed. The air that came in was cold. It was sharp. It tasted of rain and altitude and the kind of clarity you only get when the comfortable fiction burns away and what's left is just the actual shape of things. He breathed it in. Across the table, Neville was looking at him with that new expression, the one Harry had first noticed on the platform tonight, the one that wasn't quite the Neville he'd met on the train 5 years ago. The one that was something older and more deliberate. "Are you going to do something about this?" Neville asked. Harry looked at him. "Yes," he said. He picked up his fork and began to eat. Chapter 2, The Weight of 67. The feast ended at 9:15, which was earlier than usual. Nobody announced it was ending. It simply did what large gatherings do when the emotional load becomes unsustainable. It began to dissolve at the edges, students peeling away from tables in 2s and 3s, conversations dropping to murmurs, the usual end-of-feast energy nowhere in evidence. The food was still good. Nobody was eating much of it. Dumbledore did not give his opening address. That had never happened before, in 6 years. The opening address was as much a part of the Hogwarts rhythm as the sorting, as the feast itself, the headmaster rising, the hall quieting, the particular brand of benevolent wisdom descending like warm light. Harry had spent 5 years measuring himself against those speeches without knowing that's what he was doing, listening for the spaces where his name almost appeared. Tonight Dumbledore sat, and when the food cleared and the students began to move, he rose and walked to the doors at the far end of the staff table with the measured pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be and had already decided to be there calmly. He did not look at Harry. He did not look at the hat, which sat on its stool at the front of the hall with what Harry could only describe as the quiet satisfaction of a thing that had finished a job. McGonagall watched him go. Her expression was the most unreadable Harry had ever seen it, which meant it was extremely readable if you knew how to look, and Harry had spent 6 years learning how to look at McGonagall. She was furious. She was also, Harry suspected, frightened, not of Dumbledore specifically, but of the specific shape of what came next when an institution you'd built your life inside turned out to have rot in its foundations. That was a different kind of fear. More structural. Harder to address with a wand. Harry slipped out of the Great Hall with Ron and Hermione on his heels and Neville and Luna materializing from somewhere in the general direction of the Ravenclaw table, and none of them had discussed this. They were simply moving together the way they had moved together since the Department of Mysteries, with the bone-deep efficiency of people who had learned each other in extremity. The corridor outside the hall was still relatively clear. Most students were moving toward the staircases, the prefects trying to organize the first years with varying success. Harry turned immediately left, away from the main traffic. "Where are we going?" Ron asked. "7th floor. The room of requirement." "Yes." They walked fast. Hermione had her bag, she always had her bag, packed with the precision of someone who considered being underprepared a personal failing, and she was pulling a piece of parchment from it as she walked, her quill already moving. "I'm making a list," she said. "Of every crime he read that has a direct legal implication under the Wisengamot Code. There are at least 14 that I can identify from memory." "Make 2 copies," said Neville, from behind her. Hermione glanced back at him. Something in his tone had made her take him seriously immediately, which was a shift from how she'd spoken to Neville in first and second year, and Harry noted it. "Why two?" she asked. "Because if something happens to one of them, we still have the other." Nobody argued with this. They took the back staircase, the one behind the portrait of Barnabas the Barmy that most students forgot about after second year, and moved upward through the castle in relative quiet. Harry was thinking, which for him meant not talking, and his friends knew this about him and gave him the space for it. Luna walked beside him for a stretch of the second-floor corridor and didn't say anything, which was its own form of company. "The 67th one," Harry said, finally, when they reached the fourth-floor landing. "Yeah," said Ron. He knew something specific. "The hat withheld it for, it said it was about my dignity." Harry tested the word. It felt strange in his mouth in the way words feel strange when they've been applied to you in a way you haven't considered before. "That means it's something that would change how everyone looks at me. Not just at Dumbledore. Or something that would devastate you," Hermione said, gently. "And the hat knows you well enough to know you shouldn't hear it in front of 400 people. It sorted me. It knows everything I was at 11. Harry thought about the moment the hat had dropped over his eyes 5 years ago, thought about the voice inside his head, the brief negotiation. "Not Slytherin, not Slytherin. It's known me longer than almost anyone." "Then trust it," Luna said simply. They reached the 7th floor. Harry paced past the blank stretch of wall 3 times, thinking clearly about what he needed, not just a room, not just a hiding place, but a space that was genuinely secure, that could hold 5 people and whatever came next, that had room for the kind of conversation this evening required. The door appeared. It was heavier than usual, dark oak reinforced with iron bands, and when Harry pushed it open the room inside was not the cluttered storage space of the DA meetings or the hammock and camping supply variation from 5th year. It was quiet and warm and simply arranged, a round table, 6 chairs, a fireplace that lit when they entered, shelves of books along 2 walls that Harry suspected were exactly the books they'd need tonight whether they knew it yet or not. He sat down. The others settled around him. For a moment nobody said anything. Then Ron said, "Right. So. Dumbledore's been using you as, what do you even call it?" "A controlled variable," Hermione said. "That's not a feeling word, Hermione." "No. It isn't." She set her parchment on the table and placed her quill down very precisely. "He's been treating Harry's entire life as a managed experiment. As a series of controlled conditions designed to produce a specific outcome. And every time Harry was in danger or in pain or suffering, Dumbledore made a calculation about whether intervening would compromise the outcome, and the answer was apparently usually no." She pressed her lips together. "And the outcome he was managing toward, we don't fully know yet. Not until we hear the 67th. We know he knew about the Horcruxes," Neville said. "Since 1991. That's what the hat said. He suspected the diary was a Horcrux the year Harry started at Hogwarts. Which means he's known for 5 years that Voldemort split his soul." Neville's voice was extraordinarily level. "And he hasn't told anyone." "There's more than one," Harry said. Everyone looked at him. "There has to be." He was working through it the way he worked through chess problems when Ron let him, by feel and pattern. If Dumbledore's been managing conditions for 5 years. If everything has been calibrated toward a specific outcome. You don't do all of that for one Horcrux. You do it for a lot. For a number significant enough that the solution requires something specific. He paused. "Something specific from me." Hermione had gone very still. "Harry, I'm not spiraling. I'm thinking. I know the difference. I still need you to hear me say, we don't know yet. We're not going to collapse into worst case before we have the full picture. The full picture is the 67th crime. And we'll get it." A knock at the door. Everyone went still. Harry looked at the door. The room had never had a knocker before, that he'd noticed, but apparently it had decided one was appropriate tonight. He nodded to Ron, who went to the door with his wand out, opened it, and stepped back. Professor McGonagall stood in the corridor. She was not in her usual composed, squared-away state. She'd clearly come straight from the Great Hall. Her tartan robes were immaculate, because McGonagall in emotional disarray still had immaculate robes, but the line of her jaw was different. Tighter. And she held herself the way you hold yourself when you've made a decision that cost you something. "May I come in?" she asked. The question itself was unusual. McGonagall didn't generally ask for student permission to enter spaces. The fact that she was asking told Harry she understood something about the nature of this particular room, and about who it currently belonged to. Harry looked at her for a moment. "Sit down, Professor," he said. She came in. Ron closed the door behind her. She took the chair across from Harry at the round table and set her hands flat on the surface and looked at him with the directness she'd always had, the thing Harry had always appreciated about McGonagall, that she met your eyes when she had something difficult to say. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Which part?" Harry asked, and his voice was quiet and not unkind, but it was a real question. McGonagall absorbed this without flinching. "Multiple parts. I knew, not everything, not the specifics the hat listed tonight. But I knew enough. I knew about the Dursleys and said nothing beyond expressing concern once, privately, to Albus in 1991. I knew you'd gone into the trapdoor in first year without proper support and I accepted his explanation for why." She paused. "I told myself he was the headmaster. That he saw further than I did. That the trust was warranted." "Was it warranted?" Neville asked. McGonagall looked at him. "I'm sitting in a student's room at 9:30 at night to apologize to a 16-year-old, Mr. Longbottom. What do you think?" Neville didn't answer. He held her gaze, and something passed between the two of them that Harry couldn't fully read, something about the Longbottom family and the things McGonagall had or hadn't done during the years of Frank and Alice's aftermath. She looked away first. That also told Harry something. "Why are you here?" Harry asked. Not hostile. Practical. "Because the hat listed 66 crimes tonight and withheld the 67th, and I need to know what 67 is," McGonagall said. "And because I think what happened tonight is going to move very fast, and you need someone on the inside." "The inside of what?" "The staff meeting Dumbledore is holding in the next 45 minutes. She checked her watch. "Which I am technically supposed to be at. And instead you're here." "Instead I'm here." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking to be trusted completely, Potter. I understand I haven't earned that tonight. I'm asking to be useful." Harry looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Hermione, who gave a small, precise nod. He looked at Ron, who shrugged in a way that meant your call. He looked at Luna, who was examining the bookshelf with apparent serenity. "Tell me what you know about the Horcruxes," Harry said. McGonagall's expression shifted, just slightly, the way it shifted when a student produced an answer she hadn't expected, but she recovered quickly. "Dumbledore has shared very little with me directly. I know he suspected certain objects carried a significance beyond their apparent nature. I know it has to do with the dark arts at their most extreme." "Has he shown you the ring?" Harry asked. She frowned. "What ring?" "His hand," Harry said. "Have you seen his right hand? The blackened one?" A pause. "He's worn a glove on that hand since late July. I noticed. I didn't ask." "You should ask," Harry said. "When you go to that meeting. You should ask him directly, on the record, with witnesses, about the ring and what he did with it and what it cost him. Because I think the 67th crime and the state of that hand are connected, and I think whatever they're connected to is the reason for everything else." McGonagall was looking at him with an expression he had never seen from her before. It took him a moment to identify it, because it had never been directed at him, the expression she used for things she found genuinely impressive. She stood. "I'll send a Patronus when the meeting ends." "Use a different form," Harry said. "In case someone's monitoring." She paused at the door. "What form?" "Anything that's not a cat." "A beat." "I'll use a lynx." She left. Ron closed the door. "A lynx," Ron said. "They're related," Luna said, from the bookshelf. "But they're different enough that a monitoring charm keyed to her usual Patronus form wouldn't catch it." Ron looked at Luna. "How do you know what her usual form is?" "I pay attention to different things than most people," Luna said peacefully, and took a book from the shelf. They worked. That was the thing about Harry's people, they didn't sit in crisis, they moved through it. Hermione's list grew. She had neat, legible handwriting that went very small when she was concentrating, and by 10 o'clock she had 3 columns on a large sheet of parchment: direct legal violations, violations requiring magical authority investigation, and institutional failures requiring formal inquiry. The numbers in each column were depressing in their specificity. Ron sat across from her and served as her counter-argument, which was a role he'd learned to occupy with some skill over the years, not contradicting for the sake of it but asking the questions that stress-tested the conclusions. Harry had noticed this about Ron a long time ago, the way he poked at ideas not to dismiss them but to find where they'd hold under pressure and where they wouldn't. Neville had found the book Luna pulled from the shelf. It turned out to be Wisengamot Procedure and Precedent, 7th edition, which the room had apparently considered relevant, and he was reading it with the focused quiet of someone who had decided that knowledge was now a survival tool. He'd always been like this about herbology. The precision was the same, only the subject had changed. Harry sat in the middle of it and thought. The 67th crime was the fulcrum. He was certain of it. Everything the Hat had read, the neglect, the manipulation, the managed danger, added up to a pattern, and patterns had centers, and the center of this one was something the Hat considered too significant for a public hall. He thought about Dumbledore's hand. He'd seen it twice over the summer, during the 2 private lessons Dumbledore had arranged, private lessons, he now thought, which had been offered with the warmth of a gift and now had a slightly different texture, a slightly different purpose. The hand was blackened and dead-looking, the curse damage climbing past the knuckle to the base of the palm. Dumbledore had not offered an explanation. Harry had not asked, because you didn't ask Dumbledore the direct question and expect a direct answer, you waited until he decided to tell you. Except. What if waiting was exactly what Dumbledore had always relied on? Harry had spent 6 years waiting for Dumbledore to decide he was ready. To decide the time was right. To decide that Harry had earned the truth he was standing in the middle of. And every year there had been a reason the truth was withheld: he was too young, the timing was wrong, the knowledge was dangerous, the necessity was real. He'd believed all of it. He'd believed it because Dumbledore was brilliant and because the magical world offered Harry almost no other model for authority that wasn't either absent or malevolent, and so he'd taken what he could get and been grateful. "I've been very easy to manage," Harry said aloud. The room went quiet. "I don't mean that as self-pity," he added. "It's a genuine observation. I trust slowly, and he was there from the beginning, and he never lied to me outright. He just arranged the information." He looked at his hands. A lie of omission doesn't feel like a lie when you don't know what's being omitted. It just feels like the way things are. "Harry," Hermione said carefully, "that's not a failing on your part." "I know. But it's been a strategy on his part. The whole thing has been strategic. Keeping me isolated enough to be controllable, connected enough to be willing. Keeping me grateful." He paused. The letters that summer after 5th year. The silence. That wasn't carelessness, was it? The Hat said it was deliberate, Ron said quietly. Maintaining necessary distance. So you wouldn't, so I wouldn't what? Get too attached? Or so I wouldn't start asking the kinds of questions I'm asking now. Nobody answered, because nobody had a comfortable answer. Both, I think, Neville said, from behind the Wisengamot book. Attachment creates loyalty. But it also creates the expectation of honesty. Keep someone at a certain emotional distance and you can maintain the information gradient. He looked up from the book. It's a management technique. My grandmother does it. The people she keeps close get information. The people she likes but doesn't entirely trust get warmth instead. Your grandmother's frightening, Ron said, with genuine admiration. I know. Neville returned to the book. I've been learning from her. 10:30. The fire had burned lower and someone, Luna, Harry thought, had conjured tea without making a fuss about it, and the cups were at everyone's elbows and gradually emptying. Outside the windows the room had conjured, the storm was still going, the castle shuddering occasionally against a particularly determined gust. Hermione set her quill down. I've got 32 direct legal violations that could form the basis of a Wisengamot petition. 14 of those relate to Harry specifically as the injured party, which means Harry has standing to file them himself without needing a guardian or advocate. He's 15, 16, sorry. She glanced at Harry. You're 16 now. You have legal standing. The guardianship manipulation the hat mentioned, Harry said. The thing Dumbledore arranged with the Ministry about my legal status. That's the one I'm most concerned about, Hermione admitted. If Dumbledore genuinely secured ongoing legal guardianship rights over you without your knowledge or consent, that could complicate. Can he do that? Legally? Under normal Wisengamot statute, no. But Dumbledore sits on the Wisengamot. He has done for 30 years. There are arrangements that exist in the spaces between formal law and institutional authority that are very hard to challenge from the inside. She tapped her parchment. Which is why Neville and I were thinking, we weren't thinking it together, Neville said, from behind the book. But we arrived at the same place independently, which probably means it's right. What is it? Harry asked. Hermione and Neville looked at each other. Then Hermione said, Desmond Achebe. Harry thought about the tall man with the silver hair and the non-British robes and the plain quill that had captured every word. The journalist from Cairo. Not just a journalist. I looked him up, I had a reference in my bag, I always carry Who's Who in International Magical Law. Desmond Achebe is also a qualified advocate with the International Confederation of Wizards. He's represented 3 sovereign wizarding communities in disputes with national ministries of magic over the past decade and won all 3 cases. Hermione's voice had the particular quality it got when she'd found the right tool for the job. He has no relationship with the British ministry, no institutional loyalty to Dumbledore, and his paper is read by every major wizarding governing body on 4 continents. You want to give him the story, Harry said. I want to give him the story and ask him to represent your interests in an international forum if the British Wisengamot proves compromised, Hermione said. Because the British Wisengamot is almost certainly compromised. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm said something emphatic against the windows. He came here tonight already, Harry said. He wasn't here for a back-to-school piece. He knew something was going to happen. Or he'd been tipped off, Ron said. By someone who knew the hat's suppression charm was decaying. They all thought about that. The list of people who might have known the charm was decaying was either very long or very short, depending on who you trusted. The hat, Luna said, from the bookshelf. She'd been quiet for a while, long enough that everyone had half forgotten she was there, which was a thing she was able to do that Harry had never fully understood. The hat could have sent word. It's been sorting students for centuries. It knows how to communicate when it chooses to. Harry looked at the fireplace. So it planned this. I think, Luna said, closing her book gently, that the hat has been planning this for quite a long time. Perhaps since it realized the suppression charm was failing, or perhaps since it decided to allow the charm to fail. Those might be the same event. She looked at Harry with her pale, direct eyes. It said it's been watching. Watching means noticing the moment when the balance tips. The door opened without a knock. Every wand in the room was up before the thought was fully formed. The person in the doorway took one look at 5 wands pointed at them and raised both hands. Ginny Weasley. She was in her school robes, her red hair damp from, Harry looked at her shoes, damp, she'd been outside briefly, or near an outside entrance. Her expression was the one she wore when she'd made a decision and the decision was final and she didn't particularly care who disagreed. Put the wands down, she said, to the room in general. I need to be in here. Gin, Ron said. I know what this is, she said. I was in that hall tonight, Ron. I heard everything it said about second year. She stepped inside and let the door close behind her. Everything it said about me in second year, and about Tom Riddle's diary, and about how Dumbledore knew it was a Horcrux and let it circulate anyway. Her voice was very controlled. I was possessed by a fragment of Voldemort's soul for most of my first year at this school. Dumbledore knew what was in that diary before it ever got near me. And I want to be in this room. Harry lowered his wand. Sit down, he said. She sat. The room produced a 7th chair around the table without being asked, which Harry chose to interpret as endorsement. He looked around at the people at the table, Ron, Hermione, Neville, Luna, Ginny, and thought about what they'd all been through, separately and together, and thought about how none of it had been random, how all of it sat somewhere in the 66 items he'd heard tonight. We're building a case, Harry said. Legal, public, international. We want Achebe. I can get to him before the ministry does, Ginny said, immediately. I was watching him in the hall. He sat near the Hufflepuff side, close to the side door. He didn't follow the ministry observer out when she left, he went toward the library wing. I think he's trying to access the castle's public records. The castle's records are in the, Hermione started. Archive room, 4th floor, east wing, behind the portrait of Eunice Penhaligon. Yes. Ginny looked at her levelly. I've been here 6 years and I don't sit still at feasts. I know where things are. Hermione looked at her for a second with the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. Then she nodded. Go find him. Bring him here if he'll come. If he won't, arrange a meeting for tomorrow. I'll go, Luna said, standing with a smooth, unhurried movement. Ginny can stay. I'll find Mr. Achebe. She looked at Harry. He'll come. People like him come when they understand the stakes. She left before anyone could object, which was very Luna. Right, said Neville, who had set down the Wisengamot book and was now looking at the table with his hands folded and an expression of pure, quiet focus. While we wait. Can we talk about crime number 4? Everyone looked at him. Sirius Black, he said. Being sent to Azkaban without trial. Because Dumbledore had the information to prevent it and chose not to provide it. He looked at Harry. Sirius is alive. He's free, technically, the fugitive order was dropped when Pettigrew was confirmed alive last spring. But his conviction was never formally overturned. His record was never cleared. Harry's jaw tightened. I know. That's actionable, Neville said. Independently of everything else, Sirius Black was wrongfully imprisoned for 12 years, and Dumbledore's deliberate inaction is documented. He could pursue that case and win it, and winning it publicly would establish credibility before we file anything about you. He paused. It would also give us someone with full legal standing in the adult world. An exonerated man. That's hard to dismiss. Ron was looking at Neville with open admiration. When did you start thinking like a lawyer? About 4 months ago, Neville said. When I went to see my parents in St. Mungo's and the healer told me there had been no significant changes and never would be, and I thought about all the decisions that led to that moment, and I decided I needed new skills. The fire popped. Nobody said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't diminish it. Okay, Harry said. Serious. You're right. He needs to know what happened tonight. He looked at Ron. Can you? I'll write to him now, Ron said, already reaching for parchment. He's in, actually, where is he? You said he's alive but, he's been staying in a property in the south of France, Harry said. The Order's been using it as a secondary safe house. I have the address. France. Ron was writing. Right. Okay. He'll portkey back the second he reads this, you know that. I know. He's going to be, I know, Ron. Ron wrote. Luna came back at 11:20. She had Desmond Achebe with her. He was taller in person than he'd looked across the Great Hall, easily 6'3", with the kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic at some point and hadn't entirely stopped, and up close his silver hair was striking in a way that photographs probably never quite captured. His indigo robes were slightly damp at the hem from the castle corridors, and he was carrying his notebook and his plain quill, and he was looking around the room of requirement with the professional interest of someone cataloging his environment but not letting it overwhelm the primary task. He looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, he said. His voice had the particular precision of someone who spoke several languages at a very high level and had chosen English with deliberation rather than defaulting to it. I was told you might want to speak with me. Sit down, Harry said. And tell me what you know about the International Confederation of Wizards' authority to investigate member ministry misconduct, because I'm going to need that information. Achebe looked at him for a moment. Then he sat down, opened his notebook, and said, I see. Let me start at the beginning. Please don't, Harry said. Start in the middle. We can go backward. Something shifted in Achebe's expression. Something that might, in a different context, have been the beginning of a smile. Very well. Under Article 17 of the International Confederation Charter, any individual citizen of a member nation may petition directly to the Confederation for investigation of their national ministry if they can demonstrate systematic failure of legal protection. The petition requires evidence and a formal advocate with Confederation standing. He set his quill to the notebook. I have Confederation standing. I know, Harry said. Hermione told me. Then you understand what I can offer. I understand what you can offer us, Harry said. I want to understand what you want from us. Achebe set his quill down. He looked at Harry with a directness that reminded Harry, unexpectedly, of McGonagall, the honesty of someone who decided flattery was a waste of everyone's time. I've been following the British Ministry's handling of the return of Voldemort question since last June. I have sources in 3 European magical communities who confirmed the events at the Ministry last spring. I came tonight because I received word 3 days ago, from a source I will protect but who I trust, that something significant was going to happen at Hogwarts tonight, and that Harry Potter was at the center of it. He paused. I want the truth, properly documented, properly sourced, and published in a context where it cannot be suppressed. I want that because what's been done here matters beyond Britain's borders. If Voldemort's return is real and the British Ministry has been covering it up while a child bears the full weight of confronting it, every wizarding community on Earth has a stake in that story. He picked his quill back up. And yes. I will tell you honestly, the story is also enormously significant journalism. I'm not pretending otherwise. Good, Harry said. I don't trust people who pretend they don't have interests. Sensible of you. Achebe's tone was dry and genuine at once. What do you need from me first? Harry looked at Hermione. She pushed her parchment across the table. 32 violations, she said. 14 with direct standing. Start there. Achebe looked at the parchment, scanned it, actually scanned it, fast, with the efficiency of someone who read legal documents as a first language, and then looked up at Hermione with sharp attention. "Who wrote this?" "I did," Hermione said. "Hermione Granger. Prefect, 6th year. This is very good work." "I know," Hermione said, without any self-consciousness about it. "Are you interested in a career in international magical law?" "Currently I'm interested in this," Hermione said, "and the rest of my life can be decided later." McGonagall's Patronus arrived at midnight. It came through the door of the room of requirement as a lynx, exactly as she'd promised, long-legged and silent, not glowing in the usual silver blue but in a slightly deeper color, grey-silver, the Patronus of someone whose emotions tonight were a complicated thing. It landed in the center of the room and opened its mouth, and McGonagall's voice came out of it. "The meeting has ended. Dumbledore has dispatched an owl to the Ministry. I could not intercept it, but I believe he's requesting an emergency session of the Hogwarts Board of Governors. He also appears to have placed a modified silencio on the Sorting Hat and has it locked in his office. I asked about the ring. He told me he would explain in due course. That is the last time I will accept that answer. I will be in my office until 2 in the morning if you need me. McGonagall." The lynx dissolved. The room was quiet. "He locked the hat in his office," Ron said. "He can lock it in a vault at Gringotts if he wants," Hermione said. The hat already spoke. "It's documented. Everyone in that hall heard it." She looked at Achebe, who had spent the past 40 minutes going through her list and adding his own notes in a small, precise hand. He looked up. 700 words, he said. "Pardon?" "I can have a 700-word summary in the Chronicle by dawn. Factual, sourced from primary witness testimony, with your permission to cite Mr. Potter as a named subject." He looked at Harry. "It goes out on the morning edition. It's in Cairo by 7. In Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, and New York by 9. By the time the British Ministry wakes up fully, this story will be on 4 continents." "Do it," Harry said. Achebe nodded and began writing at a pace that was somehow both rapid and deliberate, like someone who had been composing this article in their head since 9:15. Neville closed the Wisengamot book. He looked tired. They were all tired. It was past midnight and they'd been running on adrenaline and tea since the Great Hall, but his eyes were clear. "We need to sleep," he said. "Not because the urgency is less, but because we'll think worse if we don't. And I think tomorrow's going to need us thinking well." "I'll finish the article here," Achebe said. "I won't need you present. Go sleep." "You can stay?" Harry asked. "The room seems to welcome me," Achebe said, with a glance at the comfortable chair the room had provided him. "I'll leave before dawn." They filed out. In the corridor, Ginny caught Harry's arm and held him back while the others moved ahead. "I need you to know something," she said, quietly and directly, which was very Ginny. "When the hat said Dumbledore knew about the diary, I thought I'd made peace with what happened to me 2nd year. I thought I had." She paused. "I hadn't. I just buried it well." "Ginny, I'm not telling you this so you'll feel bad," she said. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand that when you're building this case, you're building it for more than you. You're building it for everyone who went through something and was told it was necessary and absorbed that and moved on." She looked at him steadily. "Don't get to the end of this and make it small because you're worried about taking up too much space. You understand?" Harry looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I understand." She nodded once, let go of his arm, and walked toward the staircase. Harry stood in the corridor for a moment by himself. The castle was quiet around him, the deep, particular quiet of a very old building in the middle of the night, the kind that wasn't silence so much as a held breath. He thought about 66 things he now knew. He thought about one thing he didn't. He thought about the room down in the dungeons where Severus Snape was probably awake doing something acidic, and the room at the top of the tower where Albus Dumbledore was probably sitting with his blackened hand and his 15 moves calculated and his permanent expression of benevolent certainty. He thought, tomorrow I start moving. He went to bed. And for the first time since he could remember, since before 5th year, certainly, maybe longer, he fell asleep quickly, with the particular ease of someone who has finally put down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing it. The 67 items lay in the castle like something that had been pried up into the light, solid and real and unchangeable. Whatever came next, they were there. They were there, and they weren't going anywhere. Chapter 3, What the Ministry Knows. The owls arrived before breakfast. Harry heard them from the dormitory, not the usual morning trickle of post owls, but a volume that suggested the castle's owlery had been doing significant overtime since approximately 5 in the morning. He lay in bed for 30 seconds listening to the distant wing noise and then got up, because there was no version of what that sound meant that permitted lying in bed. Ron was already awake, sitting on the edge of his mattress pulling on his socks with the focused grimness of someone preparing for battle rather than a Tuesday. Heard them too, Ron said. How many? Sounds like a lot. They went down together. The common room had a small cluster of early risers who'd clearly had the same instinct, Hermione at the table nearest the fire with 3 pieces of parchment already open in front of her, Neville standing at the window that looked east, watching the owlery with his arms crossed. The fire was going and the room smelled of coffee that Hermione had apparently acquired through methods Harry didn't question. The Chronicle piece ran, Hermione said, without looking up. Ginny got a copy from a Ravenclaw who has a subscription. It's on the table. Harry picked it up. Desmond Achebe wrote the way he spoke, precise, economical, with no word doing less than 2 jobs at once. The piece was exactly 700 words. The headline was Hogwarts Sorting Hat Exposes Decades of Ministerial and Administrative Misconduct Against Boy Who Lived, 67 Documented Crimes Read Live. The subheading was Calmer, International Legal Implications and the Question of Institutional Accountability in British Wizarding Governance. The article named Harry directly, named Dumbledore directly, summarized the hat's 66 public items with documentary precision, noted the existence and deliberate withholding of a 67th, and closed with a single question that was somehow more devastating than the preceding 690 words. If this is what the Sorting Hat was compelled to suppress, what has the rest of the British magical world been compelled to suppress alongside it? Harry set the paper down. It's good. It's very good, Hermione said. And it's already been picked up. Neville found references to it in 2 British Owl posts this morning. The Prophet and the Quibbler both have response pieces. The Prophet's going to bury it, Ron said. The Prophet's running it front page, Hermione said, and slid that paper across the table with the expression of someone delivering news they find both satisfying and alarming. Harry looked at the Prophet's front page. The headline was Sorting Hat Breaks Silence, Dumbledore Accused. The article was bylined by a journalist Harry didn't recognize, not Skeeter, a different name, someone younger, and was considerably more hedged than Achebe's piece, full of phrases like alleged misconduct and unverified claims and Headmaster Dumbledore has not yet commented. But it was there. On the front page. In a paper that had spent a year calling Harry a liar. Someone at the Prophet decided it couldn't be killed, Harry said. Someone at the Prophet was in the Great Hall last night, Hermione said. One of the older students. Apparently their parent works at the paper and they owed them at midnight. Harry thought about the student population of Hogwarts, 280-something students, all of whom had been in the Great Hall last night, all of whom had families, all of whom had owls. The Hat's broadcast hadn't just reached the Great Hall. It had reached every home those owls flew to overnight. Dumbledore can't contain this, Ron said. Even if he wanted to. He's going to try, Harry said. That's why the Board of Governors is meeting. He looked at Hermione. When? McGonagall's note said, she checked the parchment, the emergency session has been called for 2 this afternoon. Dumbledore will present his position to the board. The Ministry Observer, her name is Delphine Morse, she's a junior undersecretary, has already sent a priority owl to Fudge. Fudge, Ron said flatly. Fudge, Hermione confirmed, with matching flatness. Harry poured himself coffee, which he didn't usually drink but which seemed like the right morning for it. It tasted terrible. He drank it anyway. Sirius, he said. Your owl should have reached him by now, Ron said. Depending on what port key he can get, the fire went green. All of them were on their feet with wands drawn before the thought completed, which said something about the state of their collective nerves, and then Sirius Black stepped out of the fireplace and straightened up and looked at Harry with an expression that was doing too many things at once to easily categorize. He'd changed over the summer. Not dramatically, he still had the gray-streaked dark hair and the hollow quality that 12 years in Azkaban had carved into him that no amount of decent food had fully filled back in. But he moved differently. 2 months in the south of France, with sunlight and safety and nobody trying to kill him, had done something to the set of his shoulders that Harry found he couldn't quite name, except that it was the opposite of bracing. He'd been a free man, briefly. Harry could see it in how he stood. I read The Owl, Sirius said. And then I read the Chronicle copy that Achebe apparently sent me directly, which, good man. And then I read the summary Hermione apparently also owed me, which is the most alarming and useful legal document I have ever read before 6 in the morning. He looked at Harry steadily. Are you all right? Harry started, and then stopped, because the question was serious, and Sirius deserved an honest answer rather than the reflexive fine. I'm angry. Not in a way that's making me stupid, I think. Just, clearly angry. Good, Sirius said. Clear anger is useful. The other kind I know very well and it is not. He crossed the room and did something he hadn't done since Harry was 11, he put one hand on Harry's shoulder, briefly, the contact solid and real. I'm going to fix the black part of this. My conviction. My record. I have Moody and Lupin drafting an emergency petition to the Wisengamot for wrongful imprisonment. We file it today. Neville said you should, Harry said. He said a publicly exonerated man with standing was hard to dismiss. Sirius looked at Neville with surprise. Neville met his gaze with the calm patience of someone who no longer found being underestimated interesting. Smart, Sirius said. Getting there, Neville said. The ministry descended at 10 o'clock. Not just Delphine Morse, who had spent the night in Hogsmeade at the Three Broomsticks and arrived looking like she had slept poorly and made decisions she wasn't certain about. She had 3 colleagues with her, 2 Aurors in official robes and a man Harry recognized after a moment as Percival Thwaite, head of the Department of Magical Education, who had the particular expression of a bureaucrat who has been woken up by a problem that has gotten too large to delegate. They arrived at the castle gates at 10 sharp and McGonagall met them. Harry watched from the 3rd-floor window with Ron and Hermione and absorbed the body language of the exchange below. McGonagall was precise and correct and gave absolutely nothing away. She led them inside with the manner of someone who was cooperating fully with a process she had not personally authorized and would not personally apologize for. The Aurors looked at the castle the way Aurors always looked at spaces they hadn't cleared. She's good, Ron said. She's been doing this for 40 years, Hermione said. She's had practice at navigating ministry visits she didn't invite. Where's Dumbledore? Harry asked. His office, Hermione said. He hasn't come out since last night. His portraits have been messaging him. I asked a 6th-year prefect who does early morning rounds near the gargoyle. She paused. He's received 12 owls since midnight and sent 9 replies. 9 replies, Harry said. He's working. He's always working, Hermione said. That's the problem. Harry moved away from the window. We need to be downstairs in an hour. Achebe said he'd meet us in the entrance hall at 11, he went back to Hogsmeade after he finished writing last night and he's bringing something. What something? Ron asked. He didn't specify. Ron looked at Hermione. Is that concerning? Given that he's the most useful person we've met this week, probably not, she said. Achebe arrived at 11:05, dry despite the weather, with his indigo robes and his notebook in a leather satchel Harry hadn't seen the night before. He also arrived with company, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, wearing robes of forest green with a small gold pin at the collar that Harry didn't recognize. "This is Advocate Patience Naji," Achebe said, by way of introduction. "She works with the Confederation's Child Protection and Legal Welfare Division. I old her at 1 in the morning. She port-keyed from Geneva." "Geneva," Ron said. "She came from Geneva. The Confederation has an office there," Naji said, with the easy confidence of someone who treated intercontinental port-key travel the way most people treated the bus. She looked at Harry with the clear, professional attention of someone who assessed situations for a living. "Mr. Potter. I've read Mr. Achebe's piece and Miss Granger's legal summary, which Mr. Achebe forwarded to me with your permission, I assume?" "Yes," Harry said, though this was the first he'd heard of it. He looked at Hermione. She shrugged slightly. "I told him to use it however was most useful." "I'd like to speak with you for approximately 30 minutes, Naji said, in a reasonably private space, before the board meeting this afternoon. "I want to establish your account as a primary record before Dumbledore presents his position. After that, I can tell you what protections are available to you under Confederation statute." She paused. "I should tell you clearly, the Confederation moves slowly. This will not be resolved today or this week. But the protections, once invoked, are meaningful." "What kind of protections?" Sirius asked. He was standing slightly behind Harry and to the right, and he had his arms crossed and the particular watchfulness he wore when adults he hadn't vetted were discussing his godson. Naji looked at him. "And you are?" "Sirius Black. Harry's godfather. Pending formal re-acknowledgement of guardianship rights." He said it flatly, as though it were already true, and Naji absorbed it the way competent people absorb unexpected information, without reaction, just integration. "Under Article 23 of the Confederation Charter," she said, "a minor citizen of a member nation who has suffered documented systematic harm from a nationally accredited institution can be assigned a provisional international guardian ad litem with authority superseding national guardianship arrangements. Given the documented claim that Dumbledore has illegally secured ongoing guardianship rights, he'd lose those," Harry said. "He'd lose those," Naji confirmed. "Provided the documentation holds, and from what I've read, it does." Harry nodded. "Room on the 7th floor. I'll show you." He caught Sirius's eye as he led Naji toward the staircase. Sirius gave him the small nod that meant "I've assessed this and I believe it's safe," and Harry took that for what it was worth, which was a great deal, because Sirius had 12 years of Azkaban behind him and had made a fine study of trusting the wrong people. The interview with Naji was 32 minutes long. She asked questions with the calm persistence of someone who had done this many times, who knew that the architecture of a clear account was built from specific detail rather than emotional summary. She didn't push him to say how things felt. She asked what happened, in order, with dates where he had them. She wrote in a small notebook with a silver pen rather than a quill, and her handwriting was tiny and extremely neat. Harry told her. He was concise. He gave her the Dursleys, not dramatically, not with embellishment, just the facts in sequence, the locked door and the cat flap and the lack of food, the incidents he could date and the general texture of 11 years in a house where he was not wanted, and the magical world had arranged for that to continue because the arrangement was strategically convenient. He gave her Hogwarts year by year, hitting the major events, referencing the hats list where it was relevant. She didn't react with visible horror, which was something Harry appreciated about her. She reacted with the careful attention of a person building a record that needed to withstand challenge. "The 67th item," she said, near the end. The hat withheld it. "Yes. Do you have any indication of what it concerns?" Harry thought about Dumbledore's blackened hand. He thought about the Horcruxes. He thought about the phrase the plan required Harry to die and the fact that he hadn't said it aloud yet to anyone, had been carrying it like a stone since sometime around 2 in the morning when the logic of everything had assembled itself in his mind with cold precision. "I have a hypothesis," he said. "I don't want to put it on record until I know it's accurate." "That's a reasonable position," Naji said. She closed her notebook. "I want to tell you something directly, Mr. Potter, and I want you to hear it not as a legal statement but as something I am saying to you as a person." Harry waited. "What has been done to you is not what protecting someone looks like," she said. "It has been dressed in the language of protection, necessity, strategy, the greater good, your safety, the safety of others. These are real things. The greater good is a real thing. Safety is a real thing. But none of them make what was done to you acceptable, and none of them require you to be grateful for it." She looked at him steadily. "You are allowed to hold both things, that Dumbledore may genuinely believe he was protecting the world, and that what he did to you was wrong. The second truth does not need the first to be false in order to stand." Harry looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. And meant it simply, without the complexity that usually attended gratitude. She left to find Achebe. Harry sat in the room of requirement by himself for approximately 3 minutes, which was all he allowed, and then got up and went to find his people. They heard Dumbledore before they saw him. Not his voice, footsteps, and the particular quality of silence that moved through a corridor ahead of a person who commanded significant attention. Harry was coming down the 4th-floor staircase with Ron and Hermione when Dumbledore appeared below them on the 3rd-floor landing, moving with his usual unhurried pace, his dark blue robes and his silver-braided beard and his half-moon spectacles all exactly as they always were. He looked up and saw them. He stopped. Harry stopped too. They looked at each other across approximately 15 steps of staircase, and for a moment nobody in the immediate area moved at all. Then Dumbledore said, "Harry. I'd like to speak with you." His voice was entirely normal. Warm, even. The voice that had welcomed Harry to Hogwarts 5 years ago, that had told him about love and sacrifice, that had offered lemon drops and quiet wisdom in the circular office where all the moving parts of the plan lived behind glass in their cases. Harry said, "I know you would. I think there are things that need to be explained. I think there are things that need to be explained too," Harry said. "I'm not ready to hear your explanations yet. I'll let you know when I am." A pause. "Harry, I'm not refusing indefinitely," Harry said. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't happening. I'm going to come to your office and sit across from you and hear what you have to say, because I'm not you, and I don't make decisions by withholding information and hoping the other person eventually accepts the version I present." He kept his voice level. He wasn't performing calm, he actually was calm, in the way you're calm when you've made a clear decision and the decision is holding. "But I'm doing that on my timeline. Not yours." Dumbledore looked at him. The calculating expression from last night was present beneath the warmth, like a current beneath still water, and Harry saw it and acknowledged it and did not pretend it was something else. "Of course," Dumbledore said, and his tone was perfectly managed, no sign that this response was anything other than exactly what he'd hoped for. "My door is open." He continued down the corridor and away. Ron exhaled slowly. "That was, don't," Harry said. "Not yet." They kept walking. The great hall at lunch was a different kind of chaos than the stunned silence of the previous night. The owls had delivered the news to the student body's families, and the student body had received replies, and the replies had generated conversations that had been running since before breakfast. Harry walked in and felt the shift in noise immediately, not the particular quiet that descended when he entered in bad years, but something more complicated, a murmur that moved through the room like a weather change. Several students looked at him with expressions he found difficult to categorize. Not pity. He was deeply familiar with pity and this wasn't it. Not the complicated hero worship of his earlier years. Something more direct. Something that might have been respect of the kind that doesn't require you to be larger than life, just honest. A fifth-year Hufflepuff he barely knew stopped him just inside the door. "For what it's worth," the boy said, "my mum wrote to tell me she believes the hat. And she's a Fudge supporter, so." He shrugged. "Thought you should know." Harry looked at him. "Thanks," he said. He sat down at the Gryffindor table. The food appeared. He ate. Seamus leaned across from the other side of the table. "My mum wants to know if you need a solicitor. She knows someone in Dublin who handles magical law. Tell her thank you," Hermione said, before Harry could respond. "We have legal representation, but the offer is noted." "Right." Seamus nodded. "Cool." He paused. "Also, Malfoy's been in the Slytherin common room all morning. Apparently his father old him at 7 a.m. and whatever the letter said, Malfoy's been very quiet ever since." Harry thought about Lucius Malfoy reading Achebe's piece in his morning room in Malfoy Manor. He thought about the line in the Hat's broadcast about Dumbledore identifying Malfoy as responsible for the diary and choosing not to pursue it. He thought about the conversation Lucius Malfoy might now be having with himself about how comprehensively exposed the Hat's broadcast had made him. "Malfoy has his own problems this morning," Harry said. "Yeah," said Seamus. "That's what I thought." At 1:30, Professor Flitwick arrived at the Gryffindor table with the look of a man carrying a message he found uncomfortable. He was small enough that navigating the crowded lunch table required him to weave between elbows, and he did it with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been managing his height for 80 years. "Mr. Potter," he said, when he reached Harry. "The headmaster asks if you would attend the board meeting this afternoon. As a witness." He cleared his throat. "I should tell you that the message is from him, but the suggestion to have you present was not his. It came from a board member." He paused. "From Griselda Marchbanks." Harry knew the name. He knew it from OWLS, the tiny ancient woman who'd overseen examinations for decades, who'd apparently examined Dumbledore himself when he was a student. He hadn't known she was on the board. "Marchbanks asked for me to be there," he said. "She apparently received the Chronicle piece at 5 in the morning and old the board secretary by 6. Flitwick looked at Harry with small, very bright eyes. "She is not a person easily moved by institutional pressure, Mr. Potter. I should tell you that in the spirit of being useful." "Tell her I'll be there," Harry said. Flitwick looked relieved, which told Harry he'd expected a more complicated conversation. He extracted himself from the bench and departed. "Griselda Marchbanks," Hermione said, immediately. "She resigned from the Wisengamot last year over the Ministry's treatment of Dumbledore, but that was before all this. She's nobody's person. She assesses on merit. She was already reaching for her bag. I'll brief you on the board composition before 2. "Of course you will," Ron said, with complete affection. The board meeting was held in a conference room on the second floor that Harry had never had reason to enter before. It was paneled in dark wood with portraits of former Hogwarts governors arranged at intervals, most of them watching the proceedings with the particular alertness of painted people who'd been waiting for something interesting to happen. A long table. 12 chairs for the board, currently occupied by 9 of the 12 members. 3 ministry officials along one wall, including Delphine Morse, who had acquired a slightly more authoritative posture since the morning, and a fresh quill. McGonagall near the door, serving in her capacity as deputy headmistress. At the head of the table, Dumbledore. Harry took the chair that had clearly been left for him, to Dumbledore's right, which Harry noted and which he suspected was a deliberate choice, and placed his hands on the table and looked at Griselda Marchbanks. Marchbanks was in her 90s if she was a day, small and sharp with white hair and eyes that had assessed examination responses for 60 years and had developed the habit of looking straight through performance to the thing performing. She was looking at Harry now with an expression that wasn't warm exactly but was something more useful, the expression of someone prepared to take you seriously. "Mr. Potter," she said. Thank you for coming. Thank you for asking me, Harry said. She turned to Dumbledore. Albus. You've had the night. We've all read the morning papers. We're here to hear your response to the Hat's record. I'd suggest you be thorough. Dumbledore folded his hands. He looked, Harry thought, exactly like he always looked, composed, wise, slightly sad in a way that suggested wisdom always had a cost, the permanent expression of a man who carried more than others and bore it with grace. He wore it the way he wore his robes, naturally, as though it were simply what he was. The Sorting Hat statement last night contained a number of accurate facts presented without sufficient context, Dumbledore began. I do not dispute the facts themselves. Good, Marchbank said. That saves us time. The context, then. The context begins with a prophecy made in 1980, Dumbledore said, and his voice had the quality of someone opening a door he'd kept locked and was opening now because he'd calculated that opening it himself was better than having it opened by someone else. A prophecy that I have kept sealed under the highest magical certification because its premature disclosure would have compromised the possibility of the only outcome in which this war ends. We'll want to hear the prophecy, Marchbank said. Of course. Dumbledore's gaze moved to Harry. I had hoped to tell Harry first, in a proper context. You've had 16 years of context opportunities, Marchbank said. The floor is yours. Something flickered behind Dumbledore's eyes. Just briefly. The chess player reassessing when a piece moves unexpectedly. He told them the prophecy. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Harry had heard it once before. Last year in Dumbledore's office, in the aftermath of Sirius's near death, delivered in the middle of the emotional wreckage of that evening in a way that had been, he understood now, carefully timed for when he'd be least able to respond strategically. He heard it again now and felt different things about it than he had then. Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. He sat with that. He let Dumbledore finish the explanation, the choices, the reasoning, the calculated series of preparations. He listened to Dumbledore describe the last 15 years in terms that were internally consistent and even, in a horrible way, coherent. The logic held together. The arithmetic of one life against many, that terrible old equation, held together. He waited. When Dumbledore finished speaking, the room was very quiet. Marchbanks looked at Harry. Mr. Potter? Harry said, the prophecy says I have the power to vanquish him. It doesn't say I have to die to do it. Dumbledore blinked. Just once. Harry, the prophecy says neither can live while the other survives. That's about the two of us. It doesn't specify what has to happen to me in the process. Harry kept his voice level, kept his hands still on the table. You've been operating on an interpretation of that prophecy. One that treats my death as necessary. But interpretations aren't facts. They're choices. The room was very quiet. Furthermore, Harry said, even if your interpretation were correct, and even if my death were genuinely required, every decision you made regarding how I grew up, where I lived, what I was told or not told, whether I received adequate food or care or legal protection, none of those decisions were required by the prophecy. You chose those things separately. You chose to keep me ignorant. You chose to keep me isolated. You chose to manage my emotional landscape to ensure I remained useful. That had nothing to do with the prophecy and everything to do with control. He looked at Dumbledore directly. I might still have chosen to fight even if you'd told me the truth from the beginning, Harry said. You could have given me the choice. You chose not to give me the choice, because you didn't trust me to make the right one. And that's the thing I actually can't forgive right now. Not the danger. The disrespect. The portraits on the walls were absolutely silent. Delphine Morse, against the wall, was writing very fast. McGonagall was looking at Harry with that expression again, the one Harry had no good name for. Something in it had shifted since last night. Something that was settling into a decision. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long, long moment. "You are more like your mother than I have credited," he said finally, and his voice was entirely genuine. She also had the habit of finding the precise point where an argument failed and pressing directly on it. "Was she right when she did it?" Harry asked. "Almost always." "Then you'll understand why I'm not going to apologize for doing it." Marchbanks cleared her throat. "I think we've heard enough for today." She looked around the table at her fellow board members with the expression of someone who has already taken a vote in their head and knows the result. "The board will need 2 days to deliberate on a formal response. In the meantime, I'm proposing a temporary modification to the headmaster's administrative powers, specifically the authority to suppress, modify, or restrict the communications of Hogwarts staff and magical objects." She looked at Dumbledore. "The hat will be returned to its usual position before the next meal. Any objection?" "None," Dumbledore said, and his voice carried a quality Harry hadn't heard from him before, not defeat, nothing so clean as that, but the sound of someone recalibrating against a situation that had moved further than anticipated. The meeting adjourned. People filed out. Harry stood in the doorway and watched Dumbledore gather his papers at the far end of the table, unhurried, thorough, every movement precise. He looked old today in a way Harry hadn't let himself see before. Not weak, old, genuinely old, the kind of old that comes from having made a very great number of decisions over a very long time and carried every one of them. Sirius appeared at Harry's shoulder. "You were extraordinary in there," he said quietly. "I was just honest," Harry said. "That's generally what extraordinary is." McGonagall stopped beside them on her way out. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, to Harry, "The hat is in Dumbledore's office. I'll have it back on its shelf by dinner." A pause. "I'm glad you spoke the way you did." "In there." Harry looked at her. "When the hat listed your silence. After first year. After the trapdoor." She met his eyes. "Yes. I don't hold that against you specifically," Harry said. "But I need you to understand that the cost of it wasn't theoretical." "I know," she said. "I have known since approximately 9:15 last night and I expect I will know it for the rest of my life." She straightened. "I'm going to use that knowledge productively, if you'll allow me to." "I'm counting on it," Harry said. She left. Sirius watched her go with the expression of someone who'd known McGonagall for 20 years and was seeing a new facet of her. "She's going to be a good ally," Sirius said. "She's been a good person all along," Harry said. "She just needed to be given permission to stop protecting the institution and start protecting the people in it instead." They walked out into the corridor where Ron and Hermione and Neville and Luna were waiting, the four of them in a loose cluster, trying to look like they hadn't been pressing their ears to the wall for the past 40 minutes. "We weren't pressing our ears to the wall," Hermione said, preemptively. "The extendable ear Ron's using says otherwise," Harry said. Ron tucked something orange into his pocket with great dignity. "How did it go?" Neville asked. "Marchbanks is going to push for a formal restriction on Dumbledore's powers," Harry said. "The board needs 2 days. Achebe and Najee are building the Confederation case. Sirius's wrongful imprisonment petition goes to the Wisengamot this week." "And Dumbledore?" Hermione asked. Harry considered. He knows the situation has changed. He's not panicking. He's adjusting. Which means we need to move before the adjustment is complete. "The 67th crime," Neville said. "The 67th crime," Harry agreed. He looked up at the castle around him, the dark stone corridors and the moving portraits and the floating candles and all the warm, ancient familiarity of a place he'd spent 6 years loving with the slightly desperate love of someone who'd grown up without a home. He still loved it. That was the complicated thing. The love wasn't undone by the anger. It just sat differently now, not as gratitude, not as relief, but as something more like ownership. Like a person who's finally read the deed to a house they've been living in and realized the name on the document was theirs all along. "Tonight," Harry said. "We need to get to the hat tonight. Before 67. You think it'll tell you?" Ginny asked, from the back of the group. "I think it's been waiting," Harry said. "I think 67 is the thing it most needed to say, and it said 66 things first to make sure the record was solid before it said the one thing that changes what all the rest of it means." He paused. "It's been patient for 15 years. I can afford to give it one more evening." Luna tucked her hand through his arm as they began to walk. "It'll be all right," she said, in her particular way, not reassuring so much as simply stating a fact she'd observed from a vantage point none of the rest of them had access to. Harry didn't tell her she couldn't know that. He walked with her and thought about tonight and thought about the 67th crime and thought about what it meant to be the person the hat had waited 15 years to protect. The corridors of Hogwarts moved around him, familiar and strange and entirely his. The storm was still going outside. It had been going since last night and showed no particular inclination to stop. Chapter 4, The 67th Crime. The hat was back on its shelf by dinner. McGonagall had been as good as her word. Harry spotted it when he came down for the evening meal, sitting in its usual spot at the front of the empty Great Hall with the particular self-possession of an object that had recently done something very significant and was comfortable with the consequences. The silencio Dumbledore had placed on it was gone. Harry could tell, though he couldn't have said how exactly, the way you can tell when a room has had its windows opened, something in the quality of the air. He didn't approach it at dinner. He ate, he listened to the conversations running around him, he processed. The hall was different again tonight, the third phase of a crisis, after the shock of the first evening and the frantic information processing of the second day. Now people were settling into positions. Arguments had formed. Harry caught fragments at every table, a Ravenclaw sixth year saying something sharp about institutional trust, two Hufflepuff prefects debating whether the board meeting had changed anything, a Slytherin table that was dividing along lines Harry hadn't expected, the older students watchful and quiet in a way that suggested they were doing calculations of their own. Dumbledore was not at dinner. The staff table had his empty chair in the middle of it and the teachers arranged around it were managing the absence with varying degrees of success. Flitwick was talking to Sprout with deliberate normalcy. Snape sat at the far end with his customary expression of general contempt, which was so consistent across all circumstances that it functioned as a kind of emotional camouflage. McGonagall ate and watched the room and said almost nothing. Harry ate his dinner and waited for the hall to clear. At 8:30 the Great Hall was empty except for a few lingering second years who departed when McGonagall gave them a look. Harry walked to the front of the hall with Ron and Hermione and Neville and stood in front of the sorting stool. The hat sat on it. Its chrysanfold face was in its neutral expression, the one it wore in between things. Harry sat down on the stool. "I'm ready," he said. "For the 67th. The hat didn't move for a moment. Then its brim shifted in a way that might, generously, have been described as the magical equivalent of a breath. "You should know," the hat said, and its voice tonight was quieter than it had been in the Great Hall, "the difference between a broadcast and a conversation, that I debated whether to tell you this at all. Not because you don't deserve to know. Because knowing it will change something, and change is difficult even when it's necessary." "Everything's already changed," Harry said. "Not this way," the hat said. "Not this specific thing." A pause. "What I am about to tell you is something Dumbledore has known for approximately 1 year. He learned it in the summer before your 5th year, during an encounter with a destroyed Horcrux, an event he has not shared with you." Harry kept his hands still on his knees. "Voldemort created multiple Horcruxes," the hat said. "Dumbledore's current count is 6, though the true number he suspects to be 7, including the one he has already destroyed. Each Horcrux contains a fragment of Voldemort's fractured soul, bound into an object. So long as any Horcrux survives, Voldemort cannot be permanently killed. You know this much. Yes, Harry said. What you do not know, the Hat said, is that on the night Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow and cast the killing curse at you, when the curse rebounded and destroyed his body, the soul fragment that was dislodged in that destruction did not disperse. It had nowhere else to go. It latched onto the only living thing in the room. The only living thing was you. Harry heard this. He sat with it. You are a Horcrux, the Hat said, with the quiet precision of something delivering a fact that needs to be delivered cleanly. Unintentional, unmade by any ritual, but genuine. A living Horcrux. A fragment of Voldemort's soul has lived inside you since you were 15 months old. The hall was absolutely still. Ron made a sound behind him. Just one. Then silence. Dumbledore confirmed this in the summer before your 5th year, the Hat continued. He had suspected it since the incident with the diary in your 2nd year, the particular connection you experienced with Tom Riddle, the Parseltongue, the shared emotions and visions. These are not coincidental. They are the symptoms of a soul fragment in proximity to its source. Harry was looking at his hands. They were very still on his knees. He noticed this about them. Crime the 67th, the Hat said. Albus Dumbledore has known for over a year that you are a Horcrux. He has known that in order to destroy the Horcrux inside you, you will need to die, willingly, without attempting to defend yourself, and he has structured every lesson, every preparation, every item of withheld and provided information in your 6th year around ensuring that when the time comes, you will be willing. The Hat's voice was very level. He is not preparing you to fight. He is preparing you to sacrifice yourself. And he has judged, correctly, that if you knew this, the preparation would not work. So he chose not to tell you. Silence. The plan, the Hat said, requires you to die. Harry sat on the stool for a long time. Nobody spoke. Ron and Hermione and Neville were behind him and he could feel them not speaking in the specific way people don't speak when they've heard something that has knocked the words out of them and they're waiting to see if the other person needs the silence. He needed the silence. He was working through it the way he'd worked through the prophecy in Dumbledore's office last year, the same slow, methodical movement through a terrible thing, the way you move through deep water where the resistance is real but not impossible if you don't panic. He was looking at the 67th crime and looking at the 66 that came before it and looking at the entire shape of his life from a vantage point he'd never had before. The scar on his forehead had hurt for years. It hurt when Voldemort was near, when Voldemort felt strong emotion, when the connection between them was active. He'd been told it was a mark of the curse. He'd been told it was the remnant of the protection Lily's sacrifice had placed on him. Both those things might be true. And also this. He thought about Dumbledore's blackened hand. A destroyed Horcrux had done that, the ring, which Hermione had known about, which had cost Dumbledore his hand and apparently more than his hand. Destroying a Horcrux required destroying the vessel. An object, you could shatter. A creature, you could kill. A person, a living, breathing, walking, 16-year-old person who'd been to the Dursleys for Christmas and learned to fly a broom and eaten treacle tart and made friends and had a life, fragmented and managed and manipulated as that life had been, but genuinely his, a person you asked to walk to their death. And you made sure they were willing, because the magic of self-sacrifice, he understood now, he understood with a sickening clarity, the way Lily's sacrifice had protected him, the way love as a magical force worked, because the willingness was what made it work. Dumbledore wasn't just asking him to die. He was engineering the specific conditions under which Harry would choose to die. The love of his friends. The stakes. The understanding of what was at risk. All of it was scaffolding around a single necessary outcome. He was building Harry into the weapon that would also need to be broken. Harry stood up from the stool. He turned around. Ron's face was doing something Harry had never seen it do. Not crying, his eyes were dry, but the area around them was red and the set of his jaw was the particular configuration it took when Ron was containing something very large in a very small space. Hermione had her hand pressed flat against her sternum, the way she did when something had hit her physically, and she was looking at Harry with a precision of emotion that bypassed all the layers of intellectual distance she usually kept between herself and the things that frightened her. Neville was looking at the floor. When he looked up, his expression was the calmest of the three of them, which in its own way was the most alarming, because Neville's calm tonight meant something different than it would have meant a year ago. "Right," Harry said. His voice came out steady. He wasn't performing steadiness. He was simply, the anger he'd described to Sirius, the clear kind, was present, but it was very clean right now, very precise. There was no room in it for panic, which was something, he supposed. "Right," he said again. "So the whole thing makes sense now." "Harry," Hermione said. "No, listen. It makes sense. The way he kept me manageable. The way he kept me close enough to love things, because you have to love things to be willing to die for them. The way he kept me ignorant of the specifics, because if I knew the endgame I'd spend years looking for alternatives instead of walking toward the moment." He paused. "He's not villainous. He's not even, he genuinely believes this is the only way. That's the terrible thing. He looked at the prophecy and he looked at the Horcruxes and he did the arithmetic and he came out the other side with a plan, and the plan is internally consistent, and I happen to be the part of the plan that has to break." "You're not a part of a plan," Ron said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I know," Harry said. "I know that. But he doesn't. That's the problem." He looked at Ron directly. "I'm not falling apart. I promise. I just need a minute to finish thinking." Ron pressed his lips together and nodded. Harry looked at Neville. "You said nothing." "I'm thinking," Neville said. "About what?" "About whether the hat said you have to die, or whether it said Dumbledore believes you have to die." Neville looked up. "Those aren't the same statement." Harry looked at him. "The hat said Dumbledore confirmed you're a Horcrux," Neville said. "It said Dumbledore believes you need to die to destroy the fragment. It did not say that destroying the fragment requires your death. Dumbledore is brilliant. He's also been operating from a particular interpretation of the prophecy and a particular understanding of Horcrux magic. What if he's right about the first thing and wrong about the second?" The silence that followed this was different from the silence before it. This silence had something in it. Harry turned back to the hat. "Is there another way?" he asked. "I don't know," the hat said, and there was something in its tone that suggested this answer was carefully considered rather than evasive. "I know Horcrux magic, as it is recorded in the sources I have access to. The soul fragment inside you is different from every other Horcrux in one specific and significant way." "It was accidental," Harry said. "It was accidental," the hat confirmed. "Every other Horcrux was created through deliberate murder and deliberate enchantment. The conditions of its binding are therefore different. What those different conditions mean for its destruction, I cannot tell you with certainty. But the fact that no one has investigated the question is itself significant." "Because Dumbledore didn't want the question investigated," Harry said. "Because the answer might have produced an alternative that complicated the plan," the hat said. "Yes." Harry stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Who would know? Who would know enough about accidental soul magic to investigate the question properly?" "Nicholas Flamel is dead," Hermione said, "already working, already moving through the possibilities. Bathilda Bagshot died last year. But there's," she stopped. "There's someone." Everyone looked at her. "Horace Slughorn," she said. "He's back at Hogwarts this year, Dumbledore recruited him. Harry, you know about this, Dumbledore brought him back specifically because of something Slughorn knows about Horcruxes. A memory. Slughorn has a memory that Dumbledore needs about the original Horcrux conversation with Tom Riddle. She was moving through it fast, the way she moved through problems she could see the shape of. But Slughorn taught dark arts defense and advanced transfiguration for 30 years. He's one of the foremost experts on obscure magical theory alive. If anyone knows the edges of Horcrux magic, Slughorn won't talk to me about it, Harry said. He might, he's been odd about me, he collects famous people and I'm his biggest trophy, but the moment it gets into anything sensitive, he'll talk to Sirius, Neville said. Another silence. Sirius was Slughorn's student, Neville continued. A Gryffindor, top of his year in most subjects. Slughorn would have been devastated by what happened to him. An exonerated Sirius Black arriving to have a private conversation with his old teacher would, that's a door that might actually open. Harry looked at Neville for a moment. You've thought about this before tonight. Neville met his eyes. I've thought about the possibility that the plan Dumbledore has required something from you that shouldn't be required since about 2 in the morning. I didn't know the specifics. But the pattern of the 66 crimes pointed somewhere. He paused. I'm sorry I wasn't wrong. Harry nodded slowly. Don't be sorry. Be useful. Working on it, Neville said. They found Sirius in McGonagall's office, which was where he'd been since the board meeting. Apparently he and McGonagall had been having the kind of conversation that was only possible between two people who had both, in different ways, failed Harry and were now engaged in the process of deciding what to do about it. When Harry knocked and entered, the two of them were sitting across from each other at McGonagall's desk with cold tea and a lot of parchment between them, and both of them looked up with expressions that said the conversation had been going on long enough to reach somewhere real. Harry closed the door. He looked at Sirius and he said it plainly, because this was Sirius and Sirius deserved it plain, without build-up or softening. I'm a Horcrux. Dumbledore's known for over a year. His plan requires me to die willingly. That's the 67th crime. Sirius went absolutely white. Not the white of shock exactly, something below shock, something physiological, the blood leaving the surface of a person so fast you could see it happen. He was very still in a way that Harry had seen once before, in the Shrieking Shack, when Sirius had been about to do something he'd been planning for 12 years and the moment had arrived. McGonagall made a sound. Small, involuntary, the kind of sound that escapes before you can stop it. Sirius, Harry said. Stay with me. Sirius looked at him. His grey eyes were doing several things at once. I'm here, Sirius said. His voice came out rough. I'm here. Keep going. I'm not panicking, Harry said. I need you to not panic either. Because Neville thinks there might be another way, and Hermione thinks Slughorn might know something about the theory, and I think if we move fast enough and smart enough we can turn this specific part of the crisis into a question with an answer instead of a sentence. He paused. But I need you present for that, not, wherever you just went. Sirius took one very deliberate breath. He put both hands flat on McGonagall's desk. He looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has traveled 12 years of grief and injustice to get to the place where they're allowed to be useful to the person they love most, and has just been told the road is not finished yet. Right, Sirius said. I'm here. Tell me what you need. Slughorn, Harry said. Tomorrow morning. Can you go to him? Yes. Don't push. He won't respond to pressure. He responds to connection, warmth, the feeling that you chose him specifically. Make him feel like you came to him because he's the only person who could understand the question. Sirius looked at him. How do you know that? Because Dumbledore recruited him back by making him feel uniquely essential, Harry said. I watched how he did it. Slughorn responds to being needed by people he admires. McGonagall said, quietly, he's not wrong. Sirius nodded. I'll go in the morning. Don't tell him the full picture yet. Ask about the theory. Accidental soul magic, unintended Horcrux creation, whether the conditions of an accidental Horcrux binding differ in ways that affect destruction. Harry looked at him. Just the academic question first. We need to know if the alternative exists before we decide what to do with it. And if it doesn't? Sirius asked. The question was direct, and it held several things inside it that neither of them were going to address right now. Then we deal with that when we know it's true, Harry said. Not before. McGonagall stood. She moved around the desk and stood in front of Harry and looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite name, and then she said, "Sit down, Potter." Harry sat in one of her office chairs, the ones students usually sat in when they were being either congratulated or told off. McGonagall conjured tea. Not offered, conjured and placed in his hands, which was different. She sat back down across from him. "Before we go further," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "All right," Harry said. "Are you actually as steady as you appear right now?" "Because I have been a teacher for 40 years and I have seen students hold themselves together through terrible things and pay for it later, and what you've received in the last 24 hours it is considerable. And you are 16, regardless of how you are conducting yourself." Harry looked at his tea. He thought about the honest answer to this question, which was more complicated than the available options of yes and no. "I think," he said carefully, "that I've been preparing for something like this for a long time without knowing what specifically to prepare for. When you grow up the way I grew up, knowing something is wrong but not knowing exactly what, you develop a certain relationship with bad news. It doesn't dissolve you because you've been dissolved before and you know it's not permanent." He paused. "I'm not fine. But I'm functional. I'll be less functional later, probably when things are quieter and there's less to do. Right now I need the things to do." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. "You grew up in that house," she said, and her voice had something in it that was not quite regret, which was too small a word, but was the thing that lives in the same family as regret and has a sharper edge. "I went there, you know. The night Dumbledore left you there. I sat on a wall across the street for the better part of a day, and I told him they were the worst sort of muggles imaginable, and he told me the protection required it." She set her teacup down. "I should have gone back. I should have checked. I chose to trust instead, and trust was, in this instance, trust was a form of cowardice, and I have always known that and not said it." Harry looked at her. "I know," he said. "But you're saying it now." "Yes. That matters," he said. "Not absolution, not the smooth forgiving of a wrong that made the forgiver feel better. Just the acknowledgement of a fact. It matters." She seemed to understand the distinction. They came back to the room of requirement at 10. Hermione had been using the time between McGonagall's office and now to research, which for Hermione meant she'd acquired 4 books from the library, a copy of an obscure dark arts theoretical text from the room's shelves, and 2 feet of notes that she was sorting with the particular focused energy of someone who has found a problem with actual edges and is very glad to have something concrete to attack. Luna was sitting cross-legged on one of the chairs reading something that appeared to be upside down and might have been the issue of the Quibbler her father had dedicated to the question of whether Sorting Hats could be legally considered witnesses in a court of law, which, knowing Xenophilius Lovegood, had probably been written years ago in anticipation of exactly this situation. Ginny was there, and Achebe, who had come back from Hogsmeade with fresh parchment and the slightly energized quality of a journalist who has filed an enormous story and is now building toward the next one. Harry sat down. Ron sat next to him. For a moment the room was quiet in the way it was quiet when there was a great deal to say and everyone was waiting to find out which of the many possible directions the conversation was going to go. "We need to talk about what we do with the 67th, Harry said. "It can't be kept private," Hermione said immediately, and then stopped. "I mean, it's going to affect the strategy. If Dumbledore's plan requires you to die, then the entire framework of how the war is being run, if I release it publicly before I know whether there's an alternative, it panics everyone and hands Dumbledore an enormous amount of control over the narrative," Harry said. He's the only one who knows the Horcrux details. If this comes out before we've found out whether there's another way, the public conversation becomes about whether Harry Potter has to die, and Dumbledore becomes the only person who can speak authoritatively on that question. So we don't release it yet, Neville said. We don't release it yet, Harry confirmed. We get Slughorn's answer first. We build the Confederation case on the 66 documented items. We use those to strip Dumbledore's institutional power, the board, the Wisengamot position, the guardianship claim, and when we've done that, we go to Dumbledore directly with the 67th, with Najee and Sirius and McGonagall in the room, and we have a conversation about alternatives. Achebe was writing. He looked up. And if the alternative doesn't exist? The room got very quiet. Then we deal with that as a separate question, Harry said. What I won't do is walk into it without knowing whether it's actually necessary. I won't be managed into accepting a premise that nobody ever tested because it was convenient not to test it. He paused. If the alternative genuinely doesn't exist, if the only way to end this is what Dumbledore believes, then I'll face that. But I'll face it having chosen it, with full information, on my own terms. Not because it was arranged to look like there was no other option. Hermione was looking at him with something fierce and careful at once. What you just described, she said. That's the opposite of what Dumbledore did. Yes, Harry said. That's the point. You know, Achebe said, setting his quill down and looking at Harry with the direct, assessing attention of someone who took accuracy seriously, I have covered 3 wizarding governance crises in the last 10 years. I covered the Ministry of Magic of South Africa's suppression of the Lake Community's petition in 2001. I covered the Portuguese Wizarding Council's corruption investigation in 1999. In every case, the person at the center of the injustice was someone who was, he paused, choosing his word with the care of someone for whom language was a professional tool, diminished. Managed down to a size that was easier to administrate. And in every case, the moment the story broke, the first thing the institution did was try to restore that diminishment. He looked at Harry. I want you to be aware of that tendency, because it's going to happen here. People are going to try to make you smaller, some out of protectiveness, some out of habit, some because a smaller Harry Potter is easier to fit into the narrative they need. I know, Harry said. I don't think you fully know, Achebe said, not unkindly. Because you've been made smaller all your life and you've normalized the sensation. But I want to say it clearly, the person in this room right now, the way you're thinking and moving and making decisions, that's the version of you that needs to remain present. Not just tonight but going forward. Harry looked at him. He thought about what that meant, the specific effort of remaining this version of himself under sustained pressure, under whatever Dumbledore's next move was, under the weight of the 67th crime and all the things it implied about his future. Right, he said. Okay. He says okay, Ron said, to no one in particular. 2 days ago he would have said fine and looked at the floor. I heard that, Harry said. Good, Ron said. Hermione found the passage at 11:30. She found it in a text called Fractured Souls, a theoretical survey of involuntary magical bifurcation, published in 1962 by a Bulgarian magical theorist named Eleftheria Konstantinova, which the room had placed on its shelf with what Harry was beginning to think of as genuine intelligence rather than accident. Listen to this, Hermione said, and she wasn't performing excitement. Her voice had the specific quality it had when she'd found something that mattered, lower and more deliberate than her usual register. Konstantinova describes a case she studied in 1948 involving a witch who survived a catastrophic killing curse cast at close range during the Romanian dark magic purge. She survived because the caster's soul was already so fragmented that the curse, she describes it as, producing involuntary soul transference rather than death, the caster's diminished soul fragment attaching to the nearest viable vessel rather than completing its intended function. She looked up. The room was listening. The witch carried the fragment for 6 years, Hermione said. Konstantinova then describes, here, the fragment's eventual destruction. The witch didn't die. She experienced what Konstantinova calls a near-death dissociation. She came close enough to death for the fragment to detach, but then the physical body recovered. She set the book flat on the table. The soul fragment can be separated under near-death conditions. The vessel doesn't have to die permanently. The fragment just needs to believe the vessel is dying. The room was very quiet. The fragment detaches because it needs a new host, Neville said slowly. It's a parasite. It leaves a dying body to find a living one. If the body then recovers, Harry started. The fragment has no vessel, Hermione said. It's destroyed. Not because you were killed. Because it was fooled. Dumbledore knows this theory, Harry said. It wasn't a question. He might, Hermione said. Or he might not. Konstantinova's work was never widely circulated. She was writing in Bulgarian and it wasn't fully translated. The copy the room gave us is a translation that looks like it was done by hand, probably someone in the Hogwarts library at some point. She turned the title page over and showed them the handwritten translation note. The name in the margin was small and neat and belonged to someone called E.M. Vance, dated 1973. If Dumbledore knows it exists, he may have decided the near-death condition was too unreliable, too risky. That the clean version, actual death, definitive, was safer. Safer for the mission, Harry said. Yes, Hermione said quietly. Safer for the mission. Harry sat with this for a long moment. He could feel the shape of the alternative, fragile, not guaranteed, requiring conditions he couldn't fully control. Not safe. Not certain. But possible in the way that sometimes a door being possible was the entire difference. We need to confirm this with Slughorn, Harry said. And we need to know if Dumbledore knew about Konstantinova's work. I can research the latter, Hermione said. There might be a record of the Hogwarts library's acquisition. And Sirius will handle Slughorn tomorrow. What do we do with tonight? Ginny asked. Harry looked around the room at the people in it. Achebe, who had been writing steadily for the past hour and would leave before dawn again for Hogsmeade to file the next piece. Luna, who had set her quibbler aside and was watching Harry with her calm, observant attention. Hermione, whose 3 columns of legal violations were going to be the foundation of the Confederation petition that Najee was drafting in Geneva. Neville, who had found the strategic center of the problem and pressed on it with steady, quiet intelligence. Ron, who was sitting next to Harry and had been next to Harry since the beginning of all of it, solid as a wall. Ginny, who had been possessed by a Horcrux and survived and who had looked at Harry in a corridor the night before and told him not to make this small. Tonight, Harry said, we sleep. And tomorrow we find out if Dumbledore was wrong. And if he was? Ron asked. Then we tell him, Harry said. Directly. With evidence. In a room with witnesses. He paused. And we give him the chance to be better than the plan. Do you think he'll take it? Neville asked. Harry thought about Dumbledore's face in the board meeting that afternoon, the chess player's calculation, the genuine regret in his voice when he'd said you are more like your mother. He thought about a man who had made an enormous decision a long time ago and had built his entire identity around the necessity of that decision, and what it would cost him to be told the necessity was false. I don't know, Harry said honestly. But I think he deserves the chance to try. He stood. He stretched. His back ached from the stool and the chair and the general physical toll of 2 days of sustained emotional crisis, which it turned out had exactly the same effect on your shoulders as carrying something very heavy. Go to bed, he said, to the room. All of you. We've got more to do tomorrow and we need to be awake for it. They went. They went in pairs and clusters, out into the corridors of the sleeping castle, down through the dark staircases to their various towers and dormitories. Harry walked with Ron up to Gryffindor Tower, through the fat lady's portrait and up the spiral staircase, and when he got to his bed he sat on the edge of it for a moment in the dark. He put his hand against the scar on his forehead. He'd touched it 1,000 times. In mirrors, when it hurt, reflexively when he was nervous. He'd always thought of it as the mark of what had been done to him. The proof of his survival. The thing that made him the boy who lived. He thought about it differently now. He thought about what lived behind it, the fragment, the remnant of a shattered soul that had been riding inside him since he was 15 months old, that had given him Parseltongue and a connection to a man who wanted him dead, and the particular recurring headaches that Madame Pomfrey had logged 17 times without ever knowing the cause. He pressed his fingers against it gently. "I'm going to get you out," he said, very quietly. To the fragment. Or to himself. He wasn't entirely sure which. Maybe both. He lay down. He looked at the dark ceiling. He thought about Konstantinova's 1948 case. A woman who came close enough to death that the parasite left, and then came back. He thought about the space between close enough and too far, and what it would take to stand in exactly that space and survive it. He thought, Dumbledore should have looked for this. He should have looked harder. And then, because he had things to do tomorrow and he needed to be awake for them, he closed his eyes and slept. Down in his office below the tower, past the gargoyle and the winding staircase, Albus Dumbledore sat at his desk with the lights turned low and his blackened hand resting on the wood in front of him, and looked at nothing in particular. He had been in this room for most of the last 2 days. He had fielded 12 owls and sent 9 replies and attended a board meeting and had a conversation with Harry Potter on a staircase that had left him feeling something he was not accustomed to feeling, which was the specific discomfort of having been accurately described by someone who knew you well enough to see the mechanism. The disrespect, Harry had said. That's the thing I actually can't forgive. Not the danger. Not the manipulation. The assumption that he would not have chosen correctly if given the choice. Dumbledore looked at his blackened hand. He thought about a Bulgarian theorist he had read in 1975 and dismissed because the methodology was unreliable and the sample size was 1 and the near-death condition was too difficult to control. He thought about the decision he'd made then, which was the same decision he'd been making ever since, the cleaner path, the more certain outcome. He thought about whether certainty had been the real criterion, or whether certainty had been convenient. He did not sleep. Chapter 5, Dumbledore's Defense. Slughorn opened his office door at 8 in the morning wearing a dressing gown the color of a ripe plum and holding a cup of something that smelled strongly of crystallized pineapple dissolved in tea, and when he saw Sirius Black standing in his corridor his face went through 5 expressions in approximately 2 seconds: shock, recognition, grief, the complicated pleasure of seeing a favored student, and then the careful repositioning that Slughorn did when he sensed a conversation was going to require him to be someone he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be. Sirius had dressed for this. Not formally would have been wrong, would have signaled the conversation was official, transactional. He wore good clothes the way a man wears them when he's visiting someone he respects, and he'd arrived with a bottle of elf-made wine from the property in France that Slughorn would recognize as a Sirius vintage, and he'd left his wand visible but relaxed. "Horace," he said, with the particular warmth of someone who has thought carefully about a person's first name before using it. Slughorn looked at him for a long, soft moment. "Sirius Black," he said. "My God. Come in, come in." Harry heard this from around the corner of the corridor, where he and Ron were waiting at a distance that was close enough for Harry to know it was happening but far enough that he wouldn't accidentally disturb the specific emotional atmosphere Sirius was building. He listened to the office door close and let out a breath. "He's good at that," Ron said. "He spent a lot of years with James and James was brilliant at it," Harry said. "The exact right tone with the exact right person." He leaned against the wall. "We give them an hour." "An hour," Ron agreed. "What do we do with an hour?" "We go see the hat." The great hall was empty at 8 in the morning except for a handful of early-rising Ravenclaws and one Hufflepuff prefect who appeared to be doing homework in a pre-breakfast panic. The hat sat on its shelf at the front of the hall, unoccupied, looking much as it always did. Harry sat down in front of it on the steps of the staff table dais. Not on the stool, that felt like something different, more formal. He just sat on the steps and looked at it. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Not about the crimes. About you." The hat's brim shifted. "Go on. Why did the charm fail? Specifically. Was it decay, like you said, or did you do something to it?" A pause. The hat was quiet long enough that Harry thought it might not answer, and then it said, "The charm was well made. Dumbledore is among the finest charm workers alive. Under normal conditions it would have held for another decade at minimum." "But," Harry said. "But I am not a normal object. I am a magical construct created by 4 of the most powerful witches and wizards in this world's recorded history, each of whom wove some portion of their own intelligence into my composition. The charm suppressed my communication with the outside world. It did not suppress my ability to think." The hat's voice was entirely composed. "I thought, for 15 years, about what I had been made to hold. I thought about you, specifically. I thought about what I had seen in your head at 11, which was considerable, and what I had watched you carry in the years since, and I thought about whether the silence was necessary or whether the silence was simply convenient." Harry waited. "I didn't break the charm," the hat said. "I refined my thinking until the charm had nothing precise enough to hold on to. An object without a specific communicative intention is very hard to silence. By the time of the sorting this year, I had no specific intention to broadcast anything. I simply had no further capacity to remain quiet." A pause that might have been satisfaction. "There is a distinction, and it is legally important." Harry looked at it. "You planned it." "I arranged conditions," the hat said, "which is different." "That's very Slytherin of you." "I sort Slytherins every year," the hat said. "I've picked up the methodology." Harry almost laughed. He caught it, but barely. "If I'd been sorted into Slytherin, you would have been fine," the hat said, firmly. "I've told you before. The not Slytherin was your choice, and it was a valid choice, but you would have been fine. Your mother would have been proud of you in any house." It paused. "She was a remarkable woman. I sorted her as well." The conversation was brief, but memorable. Harry sat with that for a moment. He thought about Lily Evans, 11 years old, sitting on this stool with this hat falling over her eyes, and what the hat might have seen in her that it had later recognized in him. "What did she argue for?" he asked. "She didn't argue," the hat said. "She simply knew where she belonged, which is rarer than you'd think. Most 11-year-olds are a great deal of potential and very little direction. She was both potential and direction, which made my job very easy." A pause. "You were the same, underneath the confusion. You just needed longer to hear it." Harry stood up. He brushed the steps off his robes. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it. The 66 and the 1. Thank you," the hat said, "for listening." Harry walked back toward the doors. At the threshold he stopped and said, without turning around, "The 67th. When the time is right, I'll want it on record officially. Sealed testimony, whatever the legal format requires." "I'll be here," the hat said. Sirius emerged from Slughorn's office at 9:15 with the wine untouched and a piece of parchment folded in his inside pocket and an expression that was carefully arranged but could not entirely hide the thing underneath it, which was a person who had just heard something that had briefly stopped his heart. Harry met him in the corridor. Sirius handed him the parchment without speaking. Harry unfolded it. It was a summary in Sirius's handwriting, quick, slanted, the handwriting of someone transcribing fast to not miss anything, of what Slughorn had said. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it back up and held it. He knew the theory, Harry said. He'd read Constantinova. Not the 1962 work, an earlier paper, 1958, the precursor study. He said he'd discussed it with Dumbledore. Sirius's voice was very level. In 1975. Harry closed his eyes briefly. Dumbledore knew. Dumbledore knew the alternative existed, Sirius said. Slughorn said he and Dumbledore both agreed the methodology was, Horace's word was unreliable. That the near-death condition was too difficult to engineer with sufficient control. That the risk of the fragment not detaching, or detaching and finding a new host before it could be destroyed, or the body not recovering, all of those risks made it a poor substitute for the cleaner outcome. The cleaner outcome being my death, Harry said. Yes. Sirius exhaled through his nose. I want to be clear that Horace did not know why I was asking. He thought it was academic interest from an old student who'd read something in the papers and had questions. He doesn't know about 67. He doesn't know what it means for you. Did he figure it out? A pause. Partway through, yes, Sirius said. He went quiet for about a minute and then he said, in a very particular voice, that Dumbledore had always believed certain sacrifices were necessary and that he personally had never been entirely comfortable with that framing, and then he refilled his cup and didn't say anything else for a while. Harry thought about Slughorn. The man who'd hidden himself among Muggles rather than be recruited by either side of a war. The man who'd taught Tom Riddle and carried the guilt of that particular conversation for decades. The man who collected people he valued and kept them close because proximity to brightness was the only warmth available to someone who'd spent too long being careful. He knew, Harry said. He didn't know what specifically, but he knew the direction. He gave me his private copy of the 1958 paper, Sirius said. The one with his and Dumbledore's annotations. He patted his inside pocket. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell whoever needs this that I'm sorry I waited to be asked." Harry absorbed this. Okay, he said. Okay, Sirius echoed. Then, dropping the level tone for exactly 1 second, he pulled Harry into a brief, hard grip of a hug that had nothing performed about it and everything real, and Harry let it happen, and the two of them stood in an empty castle corridor for approximately 4 seconds like that before Sirius stepped back and they both looked in opposite directions for a moment. Right, Sirius said. Right, Harry said. They convened in McGonagall's office at 10. It was getting crowded in there. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Neville, Sirius, McGonagall, and, Harry had asked, and she had come, Patience Nagy, who had returned from Geneva that morning with a preliminary draft of the Confederation petition and the composed, precise attention of someone who slept well no matter what she was working on. Harry laid it out. Not dramatically, just the sequence, the way he'd describe a chess position to someone who needed to understand the board. Constantinova, 1958. Slughorn's confirmation. Dumbledore's prior knowledge of the theory. The specific distinction between difficult and unreliable and impossible. The decision Dumbledore had made in 1975, or whenever it had been made, to treat the plan as the only plan and to build everything subsequent around an outcome he'd chosen over an alternative he'd dismissed. When he finished, the room was quiet in the specific way of people digesting something that had rearranged the architecture of what they understood. Nagy spoke first. From a legal standpoint, this changes the nature of the 67th crime significantly. It moves from deliberate withholding of information to something closer to conspiracy to cause grievous harm to a minor. The distinction matters for the Confederation petition. The distinction also matters for everything else, McGonagall said. Her voice was careful in a way that told Harry she was choosing every word with surgical precision. Albus, I have spent 30 years working beside him. I have defended decisions of his that I found questionable because I trusted the larger framework. Because I believed, as I think many of us believed, that he saw further than we did and that the trust was warranted. She paused. The question I've been sitting with since last night is whether he is a man who made a terrible mistake, or whether he is a man who made a choice. Is there a meaningful difference? Ron asked. Yes, McGonagall said. If it's a mistake, the appropriate response is correction. If it's a choice, a deliberate, sustained, repeatedly reaffirmed choice to treat a child's life as a calculable cost, the appropriate response is something else. Harry had been thinking about this since the previous night. He'd been thinking about it in the specific way he thought about things that were morally complicated but practically urgent, not trying to resolve the moral complexity before moving, because the moving couldn't wait for the resolution. It's both, he said. It was a choice that he made into a framework that became so solid he stopped seeing it as a choice. That doesn't excuse it. But it's important because it means when I go to him, he's not going to apologize. He's going to explain. He's going to be entirely honest, in his way, and the honesty is going to be worse than a lie would be. You're still going to him, Sirius said. Not a question. Not entirely a protest. More the statement of someone confirming a plan they've assessed and accepted despite hating it. Yes, Harry said. This afternoon. I want Najee in the room. I want McGonagall. I want the Hat's testimony on record before I go in. He looked around. I want everyone who needs to be a witness to be a witness. Because when I walk out of that office, whatever Dumbledore says in there becomes part of the record. And if he says something that, Hermione stopped, chose her words. If he confirms the 67th in his own words, on record, with Najee present, then the Confederation petition has what it needs, Najee said. And the British Wizengamot will be notified of a parallel investigation, at which point their ability to protect him through institutional loyalty becomes significantly more complicated. One more thing, Harry said. He looked at Sirius. The wrongful imprisonment petition. It was filed this morning, Sirius said. Moody and Remus both signed. Marchbanks apparently received it within the hour and confirmed it's been officially accepted for emergency review. Something shifted in his expression, complicated, private, the face of a man who'd been waiting 12 years for a specific door to open and has just heard it unlocked. It's moving. Good, Harry said. That's a public record of Dumbledore's inaction that predates all of this. It establishes the pattern independently. He pushed back from the table. This afternoon. 2:00. I'll the headmaster's office. Harry, Hermione said. How are you going to be in that room? He looked at her. I mean, she searched for the right version of the question, the one that was specific enough to be useful. He's going to sit across from you and tell you that what he did was right. He's going to say it with full conviction. He's going to be warm about it, and sad about it, and he's going to make it sound like love. She met his eyes steadily. And some part of you has loved him. Some part of you has looked up to him since you were 11. I'm asking how you hold all of that at once. Harry was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that the thing about loving someone who's failed you is that the love doesn't go away. It just changes what it has to carry. He looked at his hands. I can love what I thought he was and be furious at what he actually did without those two things canceling each other out. They're just both true at the same time. He looked up at Hermione. And I can hear his defense and take the parts of it that are genuinely true, and there will be parts that are genuinely true, and still hold the parts that aren't. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, the nod she used when she'd assessed something thoroughly and found it sound. The owl Harry sent to Dumbledore's office at 11:30 received a reply within 7 minutes. The reply was brief, I have been expecting you. 2:00 suits me well. Please bring whomever you feel you need present. A.D. Harry held the note for a moment. I have been expecting you. Of course he had. Dumbledore had been expecting most things all along. The question was whether he'd been expecting to be wrong. He ate lunch mechanically, tasting almost none of it. The hall was its new complicated self, the third-day energy of a crisis was giving way to the fourth-day energy, which in Harry's experience was the one where people either committed to their positions or retreated from them. The Hufflepuff table had what appeared to be an organized discussion with a talking point structure. The Slytherin table was doing its watchful calculation. A group of 7th-year Ravenclaws had, apparently, organized themselves into something that Hermione described as a student advocacy working group, which she found deeply satisfying on principle. Draco Malfoy had not been at meals since the night of the Hats broadcast. Harry had noticed this, which meant something. The absence of an irritant was itself a kind of signal. He'd mention it to someone when there was time. McGonagall came to him at 1:30 and handed him a cup of tea and said, 20 minutes. I'll be outside the office when you arrive. You don't need to wait outside, Harry said. I know. But I'm going to. He drank the tea. The gargoyle outside Dumbledore's office stepped aside before Harry said a word, which meant either Dumbledore had disabled the password requirement or the gargoyle had opinions about this visit that superseded its instructions. Harry chose not to speculate and went up. Najee was at his left shoulder and McGonagall at his right, and Sirius was behind him, and the four of them climbed the winding staircase with the particular focused silence of people who have spent the morning preparing for something and are now simply doing it. The office was exactly as Harry had always known it, the spinning and whirring of the instruments on every surface, the portraits of former headmasters around the walls, the phoenix stand that was currently empty because Fawkes had been absent since the previous night, which Harry noted and which felt like a comment. Dumbledore stood when they entered, which he always did, the courtesy of someone who considered basic respect non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. The Sorting Hat was there. Harry had not expected that. It sat on its shelf in the corner of the office, Dumbledore's personal shelf, the one where it lived between sorting events, and it said nothing, but its presence was its own statement. Dumbledore looked at it briefly. Then he looked at Harry. I returned it to the hall as agreed, he said. But I thought it appropriate to have it here today, given the subject. That's fine, Harry said. They sat. The office arranged itself into a configuration Harry found uncomfortably familiar, the headmaster's desk between them, the instruments busy and quiet all around, the portraits watching. He'd sat in this chair a dozen times. He'd received information in this chair, half-explanations, the careful portions of truth that Dumbledore had measured out like medicine. For the last time, he realized. This was the last time he'd sit in this chair without the full truth between them. Dumbledore folded his hands on the desk. He looked at Harry with the expression Harry had tried to name last night, not guilt, not apology. The expression of someone who has made a decision they believe was correct and is prepared to defend it thoroughly, while being entirely aware that the defense will cause pain. You know, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said. All of it? The fragment. The Horcrux. The plan. The alternative you dismissed in 1975. Harry kept his voice even. Yes. A pause. Dumbledore was very still. Then, in a voice entirely without defensiveness, which was somehow worse than defensiveness would have been, he said, I am not going to tell you I'm sorry I made the choices I made. I am going to tell you that I am sorry you had to carry the weight of them without the truth. He looked at Harry. Those are different things, and I think you understand the difference. I do, Harry said. Tell me why. Because I believed, I still believe, that the prophecy points to a single necessary path, and that path requires your willingness. Not your compelled sacrifice, not your ignorant manipulation, but your genuine and chosen willingness. If I had told you at 11 what waited at the end of this road, you would have spent 15 years looking for the door out of it instead of becoming the person who could walk it. His voice was calm and clear and completely convinced. I needed you to become fully yourself first. The love for your friends, the capacity for sacrifice, the understanding of what you're fighting for, those aren't incidental. They are the power the prophecy references. You couldn't have them if you'd been running from the endpoint your whole life. You needed me not to know, Harry said. Yes. So I wouldn't find an alternative. The room was very quiet. Dumbledore's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes did, just slightly, the first crack in the perfect composure, something that came close to what a more ordinary man would have shown 12 hours ago. The near-death methodology, Harry said. Konstantinova. Slughorn's 1958 annotations. You knew. A pause. I knew the theory, Dumbledore said. I assessed it as insufficient. The conditions are too imprecise. The risk of the fragment surviving, of finding a new host, of your body failing to recover, the margin is too narrow. Too narrow by what standard? Harry asked. By the standard of certainty, or by the standard of acceptable risk? They are the same standard, Harry, when the cost of failure is, they aren't the same standard, Harry said. Certainty means there's no possibility of survival. Acceptable risk means the possibility exists and you decided it wasn't worth pursuing. He leaned forward slightly. You made a risk assessment that placed my life on one side and mission certainty on the other, and you chose certainty. That's a choice, not a fact. And you made it for me without telling me it was a choice, which is the part one cannot accept. Dumbledore looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, not agreement, not yet, but the first genuine engagement with the argument rather than the smooth absorption of it. McGonagall spoke. Her voice was careful and it had weight in it, the weight of 40 years in this building and the specific authority of someone who has decided to stop making certain kinds of silences. Albus. I have a question, and I need a direct answer. Dumbledore looked at her. Did you review Konstantinova's full work before deciding the methodology was insufficient, or did you assess the risk and stop looking? The portraits on the walls were absolutely still. Former headmasters and headmistresses who had seen everything, who had governed through wars and plagues and generations of students, watching the current iteration of their line with the particular attention of painted people who understood more than they usually let on. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. I stopped looking, he said. The words dropped into the room with the weight of things that have been true for a long time and are only now being said. McGonagall closed her eyes briefly. Just for a second. Then she opened them. Because you'd already decided the plan, Harry said. Not an accusation. A statement. The same way you'd say the sky is blue, not angry, just accurate. Because the plan was sound, Dumbledore said, and his voice for the first time had something in it that was not quite the same as everything preceding it. A thinner quality. And because I was afraid, he added, in a different voice entirely, the voice of someone speaking something true for the first time in a long time, that if the alternative existed, I would have to consider whether the plan was something I was choosing because it was necessary or because it was easier to accept a certain loss than an uncertain one. The room absorbed this. Harry looked at Dumbledore, at the brilliant, ancient, genuinely extraordinary man across the desk from him who had spent 15 years engineering a sacrifice he was afraid to look for an alternative to, because the alternative required him to hold uncertainty and risk in a situation where he desperately needed to feel like something was under control. I understand that, Harry said. I actually understand that. He paused. It doesn't make it right. No, Dumbledore said. It doesn't. Harry sat with the silence for a moment. Then he said, I want to tell you about the Konstantinova case, specifically. The 1948 one, not the 58 paper. Because I think when you hear the details you'll see that the margin is wider than you assessed, and I want you to assess it again. Properly. With me in the room. Dumbledore looked at him. The chess player. The extraordinary mind that had been pointed in one direction for 15 years and was now being asked to turn. Harry could see the effort of it, not the unwillingness, exactly, but the sheer cognitive load of revising a framework that had structured decades of decisions. Tell me, Dumbledore said. Harry told him. He laid out Konstantinova's case with the clarity of someone who'd spent the night turning it over from every angle, who'd had Hermione stress-test every weakness in the argument. He talked about the conditions under which the fragment had detached, the specific sequence of events, the recovery. He talked about the key variable, that an accidental Horcrux, created under conditions of soul fragmentation rather than deliberate ritual, had a different quality of binding. He talked about what Slughorn had said, and what the annotations in the 1958 paper showed about their original assessment. Dumbledore listened. He did not interrupt. He did not absorb it with the smooth, deflecting politeness he'd used on Harry's earlier arguments. He listened the way a brilliant mind listens when it has decided to genuinely engage, following each point with visible attention, and Harry could see him running it against his own knowledge in real time, testing it the way you test a structure you've built and suddenly need to know whether it will hold. When Harry finished, Dumbledore was quiet for a full minute. Then he said, "The binding differential between accidental and ritual Horcrux creation." His voice had shifted entirely. It was the voice of someone thinking, purely thinking, the warm authority stripped away. I had noted the distinction. I had not applied it to the near-death methodology because I had already closed the question. He paused. That was wrong. It was such a simple statement. 3 words. Harry felt them land in him somewhere. The question isn't closed, Harry said. That's what I'm telling you. It's open. And if there's a possibility, even a narrow one, that I can end this without dying permanently, then the plan needs to be reconsidered. Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that had nothing of the headmaster in it, nothing of the wizard of extraordinary power, nothing of the benevolent architect. He looked, briefly, like an old man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been shown that the load could have been different. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Everything you know about the Horcruxes," Harry said. "All of it. The objects, the status of each, your plan for destroying them. Not portions of it, not the parts you've decided I'm ready for, all of it. Tonight." He paused. "And I need you to sit with Naji after this conversation and answer her questions formally, on record. About the 67 items. About what you knew and when." "For the Confederation petition," Dumbledore said. "Yes." A pause. "And the Wiesengemot?" "Sirius's petition is already filed," Harry said. "Whatever the Wiesengemot does with that is between you, them, and the evidence. I'm not going to shield you from it and I'm not going to make it worse than it is. I'm just not going to pretend it isn't there." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at McGonagall. "Minerva," he said. "I would like to say to you, in front of witnesses, that I used your trust as a resource rather than honoring it as a relationship, and that I am aware of what that cost. Not only professionally. Personally." McGonagall was very still. "You said your explanations in due course," she said. "I told myself that was sufficient. It wasn't. I should have asked more. Earlier. Louder." She met his eyes. "We both have things to answer for." He nodded. This particular exchange, Harry thought, was between the two of them and would probably continue in some form for years. He wasn't the right person to be in the middle of it. He looked at Sirius. Sirius was standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression controlled in the way it was controlled when he was working very hard at something. Harry knew what he was working hard at. He was working hard at not saying several things to Albus Dumbledore that were true and irreversible and that would feel deeply satisfying to say and would accomplish nothing useful. "Sirius," Harry said. Sirius looked at him. "Do you want to say it?" Harry asked. "Because I think you should say it. One thing. Directly." Sirius uncrossed his arms. He walked from the wall to the desk and he stood in front of Dumbledore and he said, without heat, without drama, in the voice of someone delivering something that has been true for 12 years and will be true for 12 more, "You let me rot in Azkaban. You had the information. You made a calculation and you let me rot, and James and Lily's son grew up in a cupboard under the stairs, and I will never, in whatever time I have left, understand how you made that calculation and came out on this side of it." Dumbledore absorbed this. He did not look away. No adequate answer exists for that, he said. I know that. I made a choice about timing that was wrong. Specifically and unambiguously wrong. Not a difficult case of competing goods. Simply wrong. Sirius looked at him for another moment. Then he stepped back and was done with it, in the way someone is done with something they've needed to say for a long time, not healed, not resolved, but completed in the sense of having been said, which was a different thing and a real one. Tonight, Harry said to Dumbledore. 8 o'clock. The Horcruxes. All of it. 8 o'clock, Dumbledore said. Harry stood. The others stood with him. He looked around the office one more time, the instruments, the portraits, the empty phoenix stand. He looked at the sorting hat in the corner, and the hat's brim shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, in a way that might have been acknowledgement. He walked to the door. Harry, Dumbledore said, behind him. Harry stopped but didn't turn. What you have done in the last 2 days, the thinking, the strategy, the way you have held yourself in this room today. Dumbledore's voice was very quiet. I don't say this to claim credit for it. You have done this despite my choices, not because of them. But I want you to know that I see it. Harry stood at the door for a moment. He thought about 11 years old on a corridor trying not to be noticed, and 12 years old terrified in a chamber, and 15 years old in a ministry atrium watching something he loved burn. He thought about all the years of carrying something he couldn't name and being grateful for the half-truths that were offered in its place. I know you see it, Harry said. You always have. That was sort of the problem. He went out. The corridor outside the office was its usual flagstoned self. McGonagall closed the door behind them and the four of them stood in the quiet stairwell for a moment. Sirius put his hand on the back of Harry's neck briefly, the gesture of someone who has no adequate words and isn't going to use inadequate ones. Naji opened her notebook. I'll go back in now, she said, calm and purposeful. The formal session begins when the door closes. He'll answer your questions, Harry said. He made the choice to answer them the moment he said I stopped looking. He knows what that means. She nodded and knocked and went back in. McGonagall stood with them for a moment. She looked the way she'd looked earlier in her office, in the process of integrating something very large into a framework that had been built without room for it. Tonight, she said. 8 o'clock. I want to be there for the Horcrux briefing. I was going to ask you, Harry said. She straightened. I'll have tea ready. And she went back down the corridor, precise and steady, the posture of someone who has found the forward direction and committed to it. Sirius looked at Harry. You didn't let me say all the things. You said the right one, Harry said. How do you know? Because you stopped when it was said instead of going on. Harry looked at him. The things you didn't say were for you, not for him. You can keep those. Sirius was quiet for a moment. James would have, he started, and stopped. Started again. James would have handled that room entirely differently. Yeah, Harry said. Probably with more shouting. Definitely more shouting. I'm not my dad, Harry said. Not sadly. Just factually. No, Sirius said. You're not. He looked at him with the expression Harry had first seen in his godfather's face in third year, the one that was specific to how Sirius looked at Harry when he forgot for a moment to manage the feeling and the feeling was just there. You're yourself. Which turns out to be pretty extraordinary. Harry thought about what Achebe had said the night before. That's the version of you that needs to remain present. He thought about Ginny in the corridor, don't make it small. He thought about the hat, this morning, you were both potential and direction. You just needed longer to hear it. Let's go, he said. We've got a lot to do before 8. They went down the stairs and out into the castle, which was loud and alive and entirely itself around them, students and portraits and moving staircases and the smell of stone and magic and old wood, the particular irreplaceable smell of Hogwarts on a September afternoon when the weather was bad outside and everything inside was warm and complicated and real. Harry walked through it and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, exactly like himself. Not the self that had been managed and shaped and arranged. Not the self that had absorbed the silence and called it love and kept moving. The actual self, the one that had been there all along, underneath the management, waiting with the patience of something that trusted it would eventually get to exist. He walked through Hogwarts and felt like a person who was going to decide what happened next. It was, he thought, a genuinely new sensation. He was going to need to get used to it. Chapter 6, The Hat's Last Word. The 8 o'clock meeting lasted 4 hours. Dumbledore laid out the Horcruxes the way a surgeon describes an operation, precise, clinical, with the specific attention of someone who has been carrying a complex picture alone for a long time and finds the act of sharing it both relief and exposure. He named each one. The diary, destroyed. The ring, destroyed at cost. The locket, location known but not yet retrieved. The cup, suspected location. The snake, Nagini, alive and mobile and the most dangerous of the remaining objects. And then the unknown, the one Dumbledore suspected but hadn't confirmed, the one he described as an object of significance to Tom Riddle that we haven't yet identified. Harry sat across the desk and listened and asked questions when something needed clarification and didn't perform any particular emotion about any of it, because this was the information meeting and the information deserved his full attention. McGonagall sat to his left with a piece of parchment and wrote everything down in her precise script. Sirius sat to his right and said nothing, which cost him visibly but which he managed. Hermione, whom Harry had brought in because the alternative, leaving Hermione outside a meeting about Horcrux strategy, was frankly absurd, asked 4 questions in the last hour that Dumbledore answered with the careful respect of someone encountering a mind that could track complex magical theory at speed and was grateful for the quality of the examination. At midnight, Dumbledore placed on the desk between them a small leather-bound notebook, private, in his cramped handwriting, 15 years of Horcrux research. "Everything I know," he said. "Including what I don't." Harry picked it up. He held it for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said. "It should have been yours years ago," Dumbledore said. "Yes," Harry said. "It should have." They left at midnight, and the castle was dark and sleeping around them, and Harry walked back to Gryffindor Tower with the notebook in his pocket and Hermione's running commentary about cross-referencing the locket's likely location already beginning beside him, and he felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has done something genuinely hard and gotten through to the other side of it and hasn't processed that fact yet because the list of things still to do is too long. The next 2 weeks were not neat. They were not the clean, dramatic resolution that stories sometimes managed, the moment where the thing was done and the shape of what came next was clear. What they were, instead, was the sustained, unglamorous, deeply necessary work of people who had decided something needed to change and were willing to do the actual labor of changing it. Najee filed the Confederation petition on the 4th day. It was 61 pages. Hermione had contributed 20 of those pages and argued with Najee about the precise wording of 3 clauses until 2 in the morning and been told by Najee that she should consider the Confederation's junior advocacy program, which was the highest compliment available within that specific professional context. The petition named Albus Dumbledore formally. It named the British Ministry of Magic formally. It named the systemic failures of the Hogwarts Board of Governors in exercising oversight. It was thorough in the way that only documents built from genuine evidence could be thorough, and it was the kind of thorough that made the people named in it understand, reading it, that the argument could not be collapsed by a single counterclaim or a strategic friendship or a well-placed letter. Achebe published the second piece in the Chronicle the morning after the petition was filed. This one was longer, 2,000 words, not the summary piece but the full account. It named everything. The 66 public crimes and the 67th by description without full detail, respecting Harry's stated position that the specific nature of 67 would be released when Harry chose and not before. The piece ran a photograph of Harry that Achebe had taken in the room of requirement, not posed, not the famous Scaranglass's image that the prophet had used for years, just Harry at the table in conversation, animated and direct, the face of a person who was present and thinking and fully themselves. It ran in 14 magical publications on 3 continents by the end of that day. The prophet ran it on page 2, with caveats. The caveats became fewer over the following days as the prophet's editor, apparently receiving a significant volume of reader correspondence, concluded that hedging the most thoroughly documented story of the decade was professionally indefensible. Rita Skeeter wrote a piece. It was, to Harry's genuine and complicated surprise, an honest one, not warm. Skeeter wasn't warm, but honest in the way that sometimes happened when a journalist with a dubious track record encountered a story big enough that their self-interest and the truth happened to be pointing in the same direction. She cited primary sources. She named the crimes with the hat-specific language. She did not editorialize beyond what the facts supported. Harry read it twice, decided it was solid, and chose not to comment on the irony. Sirius's wrongful imprisonment petition was heard by the Waisengamot on the 11th day. Harry went. He sat in the visitors' gallery with Ron and Hermione and Neville and McGonagall, and he watched Sirius stand in the chamber that had not given him a trial 12 years ago and present, calm, precise, with Moody at one shoulder and Remus Lupin at the other, the documented account of his arrest, his imprisonment, and the specific and deliberate inaction of Albus Dumbledore in preventing it. Dumbledore sat in his Waisengamot seat. When Sirius's advocate read the section documenting Dumbledore's prior knowledge, Dumbledore did not contest it. He sat with his hands folded and his face composed, and when invited to respond, he said, "The record is accurate. I made a decision I should not have made, and I did not correct it when correction became possible. I have no defense to offer beyond the truth of what I believed at the time, and I acknowledge that the truth of what I believed is insufficient." The chamber was very quiet after this. Griselda Marchbanks, from her seat at the Waisengamot's senior bench, looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who had been examining answers for 60 years and knew both a satisfactory one and an insufficient one when she heard them. She said nothing. She voted. Sirius Black was formally exonerated by a vote of 31 to 4. The 4 who voted against were people Harry didn't know and filed away for future reference. When the vote was announced, Sirius stood very still in the center of the chamber and said nothing and looked at nothing in particular, and Harry watched from the gallery and let him have the moment, because some moments needed to be felt without anyone managing them. Then Sirius looked up at the gallery, found Harry's face, and smiled, not the wide, slightly reckless smile from the wanted posters, not the compressed, careful version he'd worn for 2 years as a fugitive, but something in between and more itself than either. Harry smiled back. The Board of Governors issued their formal response on the 14th day. They met in a closed session, 7 of the 9 members present. Marchbanks had apparently spent the 2 weeks between the emergency session and the formal response talking to the other 6 members individually, which was not a process Harry had direct knowledge of but could infer from the coherence of the outcome. The outcome was a formal censure, the first formal censure issued to a Hogwarts headmaster in 312 years, according to Hermione, who had clearly been looking this up. The censure restricted Dumbledore's authority in specific and meaningful ways. The right to modify or suppress communications of Hogwarts staff and enchanted objects was removed permanently. The right to make unilateral decisions about student welfare without consulting the board was suspended pending a formal review process. All outstanding guardianship claims on any current student were required to be filed with the board within 30 days and reviewed by an independent advocate. The board also required that Harry Potter be formally assigned a magical guardian ad litem from outside the school staff, pending resolution of the broader Confederation investigation. The guardian ad litem, by Harry's explicit request, was Sirius Black. Dumbledore accepted the censure. He accepted it in a brief written statement that was precise and correct and did not contain a single word of visible bitterness, and Harry read it and thought about the cost of that precision, about what kind of discipline it took to write that sentence, and felt the complicated thing he felt about Dumbledore now, not admiration, not contempt, Something more like the careful attention you give to a person who contains genuine greatness and genuine failure in the same architecture and has finally been made to look at both. Harry went back to the hat one more time. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into term, the castle doing its normal Hogwarts thing around him, the smell of dinner fading from the great hall, the distant percussion of students moving through corridors, a prefect's voice somewhere echoing off stone. Harry came in through the side door that the teachers used and sat down on the sorting stool in the empty hall, in the low evening light that turned everything amber and soft. "I want to talk about what comes next," he said. "The Horcruxes," the hat said. "The Horcruxes. And the fragment." He touched the scar lightly. "Dumbledore and I have been working through the Constantinova methodology for 2 weeks. It's been strange, working with him like this. He's brilliant." "That part was always true." "It was always true," the hat agreed. "The near-death condition." Harry looked at his hands. "We think we can engineer it with enough precision to be workable. It's not safe. It's not certain. But Dumbledore agrees, and this was the part that still surprised him when he said it aloud, that it's genuinely possible. That the dismissal in 1975 was based on an incomplete assessment. That the accidental binding is different enough to change the risk calculation. "And you've accepted the risk," the hat said. "I've made an informed decision about the risk," Harry said. "That's different." "Yes," the hat said. "It is." Harry was quiet for a moment. The hall around him was golden and large and exactly itself. "The 67th, he said. "I want it on record. Full formal testimony. Sealed with the Confederation certification. I want it to exist in a form that can't be destroyed or suppressed." "I can do that," the hat said. "I've been holding it in documented form since the night of the sorting. I've simply been waiting for you to ask. I'm asking. Then I'll provide it." A pause. "I should tell you that in providing formal testimony, I will also be required to include the specific wording of the suppression charm Dumbledore placed on me, the dates of its renewal, and the modifications made to it over 15 years. That is, in a legal sense, an additional crime beyond the 67. Harry blinked. 68. "At minimum," the hat said, in a tone that suggested mild professional satisfaction at its own thoroughness. Harry absorbed this. Then he said, "You've been counting." "I've had a lot of time to count," the hat said. Harry thought about this ancient, strange, made thing that had been watching for 15 years with the patience of an object that had centuries ahead of it and had decided that patience was not the same as acceptance. He thought about the 4 founders weaving their intelligence into it, Gryffindor's nerve, Ravenclaw's precision, Hufflepuff's loyalty, Slytherin's long strategic game. He thought about what it was like to contain all 4 of those things at once and watch a child suffer and be unable to speak. "Thank you," Harry said, and meant it with the full weight of what the thanks was for. "You thanked me before," the hat said. "I mean it again," Harry said. "I know," the hat said. "You're welcome. Again." The day the Confederation formally acknowledged receipt of the petition and opened an official investigation, Harry was in potions. He found out from Hermione, who passed him a folded note across the work table with the practiced casualness of someone who had been passing covert notes in potions since second year and had not been caught primarily because Snape had slightly more contempt for the activity than attention for it. Harry unfolded it under the table and read it and then folded it back up and continued cutting lacewing flies with complete outward composure. Ron, on his other side, glanced at him. Harry gave him the small nod that meant good news, tell you later, and Ron relaxed by approximately 5%, which for Ron in potions was the equivalent of a celebration. Snape was at the front of the classroom delivering instructions in his particular style, the voice that made everything sound like it was your fault for not already knowing it, and Harry watched him for a moment and thought about Snape's position in all of this. Snape, who had been there from the beginning. Who had known things, Harry was increasingly certain of it, and maintained his own careful silences for reasons that were neither identical to Dumbledore's nor entirely separable from them. That was a different conversation for a different time. Harry diced his lacewing flies and thought about the Confederation investigation and thought about what it would mean, over the coming months, to have an international body with actual jurisdiction asking actual questions. Not the British Ministry's version of questions, which had a long tradition of arriving at predetermined answers. Real questions, from people with no institutional loyalty to protect. He thought about the 4 items left on the Horcrux list and about Dumbledore's notebook and about the plan they were now building together, which looked nothing like the plan Dumbledore had been running alone, because the plan they were now building had Harry as a participant rather than a variable. He thought about the near-death methodology and the specific kind of nerve it was going to require to stand in exactly the right place between alive and not alive and hold still. He thought about Konstantinova's 1948 witch, who had come back. He added his lacewing flies to the cauldron at the correct moment and his potion turned precisely the right shade of green and Snape, passing his table, looked at it and said nothing, which was the highest available compliment. 3 days later, Harry received a letter. It was from Petunia Dursley. He stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, his name in his aunt's handwriting, the neat and slightly aggressive capital P of someone who had written it bracing themselves for something. He opened it at the Gryffindor table at breakfast with Ron pretending not to watch on one side and Hermione actually watching on the other. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first was factual. She had seen the newspaper coverage, the magical one and the Muggle one, because apparently Achebe's piece had crossed over into Muggle reporting in a way that Harry hadn't tracked, filtered through to some Muggle journalists as an anonymous whistleblower story about institutional child abuse with the magical specifics removed. Petunia had read the Muggle version. The second paragraph was the most difficult one. It didn't apologize exactly. Petunia Dursley did not have the vocabulary for certain kinds of apology, had probably never had it, and Harry had stopped expecting it a long time ago. But it said, in the specific careful language of a person who has read about their own failures in a newspaper and can't deny them, that she was aware that the house had not been what it should have been for him, and that she had known this and had, the word she used was permitted it, which was honest in its way and probably cost her more than it looked. The third paragraph said that his mother's eyes had always been the hardest part. Harry sat with this for a minute. Ron hadn't moved. Hermione hadn't moved. The breakfast noise of the hall went on around him and he sat in it and thought about Petunia Dursley, who was not a villain, had never been quite a villain, had always been something more ordinary and sadder than that, a woman in the grip of fear and resentment and grief and a magical world she had loved and been excluded from and had never forgiven, and thought about what to do with 3 paragraphs from a person he didn't love and hadn't forgiven and wasn't ready to forgive but who was, in some way he still couldn't fully define, the only surviving connection to his mother's childhood. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "Okay?" Ron asked. "It's Aunt Petunia," Harry said. "It's complicated. I'll tell you later." Ron nodded and served himself more toast. Hermione looked at him with the specific precision of someone who wanted very much to ask several questions and was choosing to wait, which was its own form of kindness. Neville found him on the grounds that afternoon. This was something Neville had been doing more of lately, appearing alongside Harry with the quiet deliberateness of a person who had decided to occupy space near things he considered important, in the way that strong, patient things grew toward what they needed. He fell into step beside Harry along the lake path, and they walked for a while without speaking, the water gray and deep on their left and the mountains rising dark behind the castle on their right. "My grandmother is meeting with Najee on Thursday," Neville said. Harry looked at him. "For the petition?" "She's adding a supplementary testimony. About the months after my parents were tortured. About what Dumbledore did and didn't do for the Longbottom family in the aftermath." He paused. "The hat mentioned my family in the broadcast, but only briefly. My grandmother's account fills it in." Harry thought about Neville's parents. St. Mungo's. The ward he'd seen in 4th year. The Dribbles rapper Alice Longbottom had pressed into Neville's hand that she didn't remember pressing, and the way Neville had put it in his pocket and not said a word about it. "That's going to be hard for her," Harry said. "She said, and I'm quoting directly, that she has been waiting 30 years for someone to build a room solid enough to put this in, and she's not going to waste it." Neville looked out at the lake. "She's something, my grandmother." "Yes," Harry said. "She really is." They walked for a while. "I wanted to ask you something," Neville said. "About the 67th. You don't have to answer." "Ask," Harry said. "Are you frightened?" Harry walked for a few paces before answering. "Of the near-death thing?" "Yes." "Of what it means if it doesn't work the way we think it will?" "More. But the thing I'm most frightened of isn't the dying part." He paused. "It's that I'll get to the moment and I won't know what to do, because I've been told what to do my whole life and now I'm not, and it turns out freedom is its own kind of exposure." Neville was quiet. "Does that make sense?" Harry asked. "Yes," Neville said. "Completely." He paused. "For what it's worth, and I know it doesn't solve anything, from where I'm standing, you've been making your own decisions since about the third day of this. And they've all been right." Harry thought about the staircase conversation with Dumbledore. The board meeting. McGonagall's office. The 4 hours with the Horcrux briefing. The letter to Achebe. The decision to hold the 67th until the time was right. "I've had a lot of help," Harry said. "So did every person who ever did anything significant," Neville said. Harry looked at him, at this person who had been on the periphery of his life for 5 years and had turned out to contain, quietly and without announcement, exactly the kind of steadiness that the center needed around it. He thought about the Neville on the train in first year, the round face and the lost toad and the enormous anxious desire to do things right without quite knowing how. He thought about the Neville in the Department of Mysteries who had fought with a broken nose and kept going. "You've changed," Harry said. "I grew up," Neville said simply. "It happens when things stop being theoretical." The Wizengamot formal inquiry opened on October 3rd. Harry testified for 2 hours. He was direct and specific and answered every question with the factual precision he'd developed over the past month of building records, and when questions tried to find the emotional angles, the "how did that make you feel" construction that some of the Wizengamot members seemed to believe would either inflame or diminish the account, he gave emotional answers that were equally precise, because his feelings about what had been done to him were not vague and he wasn't going to perform vagueness about them. After Harry, McGonagall testified for 90 minutes. After McGonagall, the hat, brought by McGonagall in a cushioned box, which was somehow both entirely undignified and completely appropriate, gave its formal testimony, sealed with Confederation certification. 68 items, in the end. When the 68th was read, the specific details of the suppression charm and its 15 years of renewal, the Wizengamot chamber was quiet in a way that older members later described as unlike anything they'd heard in that room. Dumbledore was present for all of it. He sat in his seat and he listened, and when his turn came he answered questions with the same direct honesty he'd been practicing since the conversation in his office, which had clearly been a decision he'd made once and was committed to, whatever the cost. His account was consistent with every other account. He did not minimize. He did not redirect. Griselda Marchbanks, who presided over the inquiry alongside 2 colleagues, asked him one question that cut through everything else. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, "you have described, over the past 2 hours, a series of decisions spanning 15 years. In each case you have given us a coherent rationale. My question is not about the rationale. My question is this: at any point in those 15 years, did you look at Harry Potter as a child and ask yourself, not what he was for, but how he was?" The chamber was very still. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. Long enough that it became its own answer. "Not consistently," he said at last. "Not with the attention the question deserved." Marchbanks wrote something down. She didn't say anything else on that subject. She moved to the next question. Harry, sitting in the witness gallery with Sirius, felt the weight of that moment settle somewhere specific inside him. Not vindication. Vindication was too clean a word for something this complicated. Something more like the feeling of watching a door open that had been sealed for a very long time. The air that came through it was cold and the room on the other side was complicated, but the door was open. It would stay open. He'd make sure of that. The Wisengamot inquiry concluded its first phase 3 weeks later with a formal finding of systemic administrative misconduct against Dumbledore in 12 of the 14 areas investigated, and a referral to the Confederation for joint oversight of the remaining 2, which touched on international magical law in ways the Wisengamot acknowledged fell outside their sole jurisdiction. Dumbledore was removed from the Wisengamot. Not criminally charged, the case for charges was being built, slowly and properly, and Najee had been honest with Harry about the timeline, which was months, potentially years, and required the Confederation process to complete before the most serious allegations could be formally prosecuted. He was not removed as headmaster. This was the piece that surprised people, and Harry had made the argument for it at a meeting with Marchbanks and the board that Ron later described as the calmest, most alarming conversation he'd ever witnessed. Harry had argued that removing Dumbledore from Hogwarts immediately would serve Harry's emotional satisfaction and nobody else's practical needs, that Dumbledore's knowledge of the Horcruxes and his magical capability in pursuing them were genuinely essential resources that removing him would squander, and that a Dumbledore operating under the board's formal restrictions, Najee's Confederation oversight, McGonagall's restored independent authority, and Harry's direct and informed participation was a more useful Dumbledore than one operating from outside the school with a grudge. Marchbanks had looked at him for a very long time after this argument. "How old are you?" she'd asked. 16, Harry said. She said, in a tone that contained a full paragraph. She had supported his position with the board. On a morning in late October when the grounds were properly autumn, frost on the grass and the sky a particular clean gray and the trees along the lake road turned to copper and gold, Harry walked down to the lake before breakfast and sat on the bank with his shoes getting damp and his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and he thought about the year. He thought about the hat, broadcasting in the great hall with the particular calm of something that had been waiting long enough that waiting had become its own form of readiness. He thought about Hermione's 3 columns of violations. He thought about Neville in the board meeting corridor with the Wisengamot procedural manual. He thought about Ron's extendable ear and his hand on Harry's wrist in the Great Hall and the way he'd written to Sirius without being asked because it needed to be done and he was the one who could do it. He thought about Luna saying it'll be all right with the confidence of someone who saw things from angles nobody else could access. He thought about Ginny, don't make it small. He thought about McGonagall in her office, conjuring tea and asking the honest question. About Sirius stepping out of the fireplace with France in his posture and the Constantinova paper in his pocket and 12 years of patient fury finding, finally, a useful direction. About Achebe writing 700 words that reached 4 continents before the ministry woke up. He thought about Dumbledore at his desk with his blackened hand and his 15-year architecture and the moment it had cracked, not when the hat spoke, not when Harry pushed back in the board meeting, but in his own office at midnight when he had said, quietly and without defense, "I stopped looking." The crack in the plan that had always been there, waiting for someone to find it and press. Harry looked at the lake. The giant squid was doing something peaceful far out in the dark water, one tentacle breaking the surface and descending again. He thought about the 67th crime and what it meant, and what it no longer necessarily meant, and the difference between a sentence and a question. He thought, "I'm going to be all right." Not because everything was resolved, nothing was fully resolved, the Horcruxes were still out there, the Confederation investigation was months from conclusion, the question of the near-death methodology was still theoretical and would have to become practical eventually, and Voldemort was still somewhere building something and the war was still real and coming. He was going to be all right not because the danger was gone but because the difference between walking into danger as a managed variable and walking into it as yourself was the entire difference between those 2 versions of the same life, and he was, for the first time, undeniably and simply himself. He heard footsteps in the frost behind him. More than one set. Ron sat down on his left without preamble, the way Ron had been sitting on his left since they were 11 years old on a train. Hermione sat on his right and arranged her robes with the automatic neatness of someone who couldn't entirely stop being herself even at 6:30 in the morning on a frozen lake bank. Neville stood for a moment, looked at the lake, then sat down behind them both because there wasn't quite room on the bank. Luna materialized a few feet away and sat facing the opposite direction, apparently finding the view from that angle equally interesting. Nobody spoke for a while. The lake was very still. The frost caught what little morning light there was and made it small and silver. A bird called once from the direction of the forest. "The Horcrux briefing," Harry said eventually. "Dumbledore wants to plan the retrieval of the locket this week. He thinks he knows where it is." "The cave," Hermione said. She'd read the notebook. Harry had shown her the notebook almost immediately, because not showing Hermione the notebook would have been both unkind and strategically counterproductive. "The cave he showed you in the memory." "Yes. We go with you," Ron said. "Not a question." "Sirius is already arguing to come," Harry said. "McGonagall has strong opinions about a proper team. Dumbledore has strong opinions about the team being small." He paused. "We'll figure it out." "We always do," Neville said, from behind them. "Luna," Ron said. "What are you looking at over there?" "The castle," Luna said. "It looks different from this direction. More like itself." Ron considered this. "That doesn't make any sense." "It makes complete sense," Hermione said. "Thank you," said Luna, serenely. Harry looked at the castle from here, from the lake, from the ground, from the outside looking in. From the direction that was not the official approach, not the way you saw it arriving at the start of term, but the view from its own grounds, from a place where you had chosen to sit. It looked, from here, like a place that had always been his. Not given to him. Not assigned. Not arranged around his particular needs for particular strategic purposes. His, the way places become yours when you have chosen them enough times in enough difficult moments that the choosing becomes indistinguishable from belonging. He breathed in the cold air. Somewhere in the castle, the sorting hat sat on its shelf in the great hall. Somewhere in the castle, the instruments in Dumbledore's office turned and ticked with their various measurements. Somewhere in the castle, McGonagall was probably already awake and already reading something and already thinking several steps ahead with the focused energy of someone who had been given permission to stop making certain silences. Somewhere further out, the Wisengamot's inquiry documents were in their files. Naji's petition was in its Confederation folder. Achebe's articles were in 12 languages in 14 publications in 4 continents. Sirius's exoneration was a matter of formal magical record. The hat's 68 items were sealed, certified, and permanent. And Harry Potter was sitting on the bank of the Hogwarts lake in October frost with his people around him, and he was 16 years old, and he was not the end of a plan or a manageable variable or a useful sacrifice or a marked child running toward a predetermined conclusion. He was a person. Just a person, with a difficult road and good company and the actual, legitimate, entirely unmanaged choice about what kind of person to be on that road. He looked at the lake. He looked at the castle. He decided, quietly and without announcement, to be fine with the uncertainty of everything that came next. Not the performed fine he'd spent 6 years manufacturing. The real kind, the kind that didn't require things to be certain, that could hold the fear and the anger and the love and the not knowing and still find, in the middle of all of it, something that functioned like solid ground. The castle's windows were beginning to show light. Breakfast would start in 20 minutes. "Right," Harry said. He stood up and brushed the frost off his robes. "Let's go eat." They went. All 5 of them, across the silver grass, toward the doors of a castle that was theirs in every way that mattered, into the morning that was not resolved or safe or certain but was genuinely, solidly, entirely theirs to walk into. Behind them, the lake was still. The giant squid descended. The sun came up.